Chapter 1. The Delusions of Malrith Duskblade. The chill winds of Naggaroth swept through the spires of Kar, rattling the obsidian towers that loomed like jagged teeth against the ashen sky. Malrith Duskblade stood before the cracked mirror in his study, the faint glow of sorcerous candles casting his angular face in an unholy light. He adjusted his black cloak, trimmed with sable fur from a beast slain in some long-forgotten raid, and tightened his grip on the silver dagger he always carried, not for battle but for the symbolic weight of power it conferred. Power. Malrith's thoughts lingered on the word. His lineage was unimpressive by dark elf standards. His family name barely carried enough weight to secure their modest holdings. The Duskblades were nobility, true but only in title, never in dominance. His parents had clung to their lands by groveling to stronger houses, flattering their way into temporary alliances that inevitably soured. But Malrith was not his parents. Before him, a dozen ancient tomes lay open, their pages filled with curling script and diagrams of sorcerous sigils. These texts spoke of the glorious past of Naggaroth, when cunning and strength were intertwined, and greatness was achieved through a delicate dance of manipulation and bloodshed. They whispered of lords and sorcerers who rose to prominence not with brute force, but with webs of lies spun so fine their victims didn't realize they were ensnared until their throats were slit. Malrith's pale lips curled into a cold smile. "The Spider of Kar," he whispered, savoring the words. The title had come to him as if whispered by Cain himself during a sleepless night. He would embody the cunning of the spider, the patience of the predator, and the deadly precision of the assassin. The other noble houses of Kar, bloated with arrogance and too focused on their immediate gains, would underestimate him. That would be their downfall. "While they grasp for swords, I will wield their minds," he murmured, pacing the study. His boots clicked against the obsidian floor, the sound like the deliberate tapping of claws. "And when the lords of Naggaroth kneel before me, they will not even know whose web they are trapped in." The vision was intoxicating. He saw himself standing before the Witch King, Malekith himself, offering tribute while veiling his ambition beneath layers of false humility. He would climb higher and higher, a silent shadow rising through the ranks of the Druchii elite. All it would take was a little patience, a few carefully crafted lies, and the willingness to spill blood when the moment demanded it. "Greatness is born of cunning, not strength," he proclaimed to the empty room. Of course there were obstacles, rival nobles who sneered at him in the court, merchant lords who saw him as a minor pest, and the sorceresses of Grond who barely acknowledged his existence. They would all fall in time. For now, he would begin with Lord Kellar the Black, a pompous brute whose holdings bordered his own. Kellar had long disrespected Malrith, dismissing him as a cowardly schemer. How fitting that the first strand of his web would be spun around Kellar's throat. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Enter," Malrith commanded, his voice sharp. A hunched servant stepped in, bowing low. "My lord Vaelrith Shadeborn has arrived. He awaits your audience." Malrith's smile widened. Vaelrith was a corsair with a reputation for pragmatism and cruelty, a perfect retainer for a man of Malrith's vision. Manipulating Vaelrith would be a challenge, but the corsair's loyalty could be bought with promises of plunder and power. "Send him in," Malrith said, smoothing his cloak. As the servant departed, Malrith glanced at the mirror once more, straightening his posture. He needed Vaelrith to see strength and confidence, not the lingering insecurities of a minor noble. "The spider of Kar begins to spin his web," he whispered to his reflection. The door opened, and Vaelrith entered, his scarred face betraying neither deference nor disdain. The corsair's eyes took in the room with a calculating gaze, lingering briefly on Malrith. Malrith extended a hand in mock camaraderie. "Vaelrith Shadeborn, I welcome you to my domain. Together, we will weave a tapestry of power that will shake Kar to its core." Vaelrith raised an eyebrow but said nothing, the faintest hint of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. Malrith saw it and ignored it. Let the corsair think him a fool for now. That, too, was part of the web. Chapter 2. A Reluctant Alley. The air in the chamber was heavy with the scent of blood incense, a cloying perfume that coiled in the lungs like smoke from a sacrificial brazier. Malrith Duskblade sat at the head of a long onyx table, fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin. Across from him stood Malrith Shadeborn, tall and lean, his face weathered by years of salt spray and battle. His black hair was tied back, revealing an angular face marred by a long scar running down his cheek. His eyes, cold and unamused, surveyed Malrith with the faintest glimmer of disdain. Malrith smiled thinly. The spider must not startle the fly, he reminded himself. Malrith, he began, his voice silken, I see the skepticism in your eyes. You wonder why I summoned you here, why a noble of my stature would seek the company of a corsair. Malrith's lip twitched. The thought had crossed my mind, my lord. Malrith ignored the subtle mockery, leaning forward slightly. Because I see potential in you. You are not like the other brutish sea-wolves, consumed by petty plunder and fleeting pleasure. No, you are a man of ambition, a man who understands that true power lies not in the blade, but in the hand that directs it. Malrith's expression didn't change, but his silence was telling. Malrith pressed on. Karankar is a nest of snakes, and I intend to rule it. Not through raw strength, mind you, but through cunning, precision, and control. I am building something grand, something enduring. And I need allies, partners who can share my vision. Your vision, Malrith echoed flatly, crossing his arms. And what precisely does this vision entail? Malrith's smile widened. He rose from his chair, pacing the room with calculated ease. Imagine a Karankar where the strongest houses bend the knee without ever realizing they have been defeated, where the merchants and slavers pay tribute without a drop of blood spilled, where the rulers of Naggaroth speak my name with both fear and admiration. He turned to face Malrith, his dark eyes gleaming with fervor. And when I rise to power, you, Malrith Shadeborn, will stand at my side. No longer a mere corsair, but a lord in your own right. Wealth, influence, dominion, it will all be yours. Malrith raised an eyebrow, his skepticism palpable. A noble offer, my lord. But forgive my bluntness. What makes you think you can deliver on such lofty promises? From what I've heard, the Duskblade name doesn't exactly inspire terror in the hearts of Karankar's elite. Malrith's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. The Duskblade name is merely the chrysalis. I am the spider that will emerge from it. My rivals underestimate me, and that is their greatest folly. You will see, together we will weave a web so intricate, so insidious, that they will be ensnared before they even realize it. Malrith's gaze lingered on Malrith for a long moment. Then, to Malrith's irritation, the corsair chuckled softly. You certainly have a flair for theatrics, Malrith said, his voice laced with amusement. I'll give you that. But theatrics won't win you allies, my lord. Nor will they protect you when those rivals you speak of decide they've had enough of your scheming. Malrith clenched his fist behind his back, but his face remained impassive. You think me delusional? I think you're bold, Malrith replied, his tone carefully neutral. And boldness has a way of getting people killed in Naggaroth. Still, I'll admit, your ambition intrigues me. And if nothing else, it could be entertaining. Malrith allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Then you accept? Malrith's expression hardened. I accept on 2 conditions. First, you will provide the resources I require, gold, weapons, and men, to ensure our ventures have a chance of success. Second, if I find that your vision puts my life at unnecessary risk, I reserve the right to walk away. Agreed? Malrith inclined his head, though the thought of Malrith abandoning him was laughable. The corsair would stay, not out of loyalty, but because the web would tighten around him until escape was impossible. Agreed. Together we will change the face of Karankar. Malrith's smirk returned. If nothing else, this should be interesting. As Malrith turned and left the chamber, Malrith allowed his facade of calm to drop. He returned to his seat, fingers drumming against the table as he replayed the conversation in his mind. Malrith was dangerous, too clever for his own good, but that made him a valuable tool. In time, Malrith would see the brilliance of the spider's web, and if he didn't, well, even the most reluctant ally could serve as bait. Patience, Malrith murmured to himself, his smile returning. The web is only beginning to take shape. Chapter 3. The First Web. The halls of Car buzzed with activity. Merchants scurried to and fro, their servants hauling crates filled with the spoils of raiding, spices from the Southlands, ivory from Lustria, and slaves with terror in their eyes. This was the lifeblood of the city, the unholy commerce that sustained the Dark Elf Empire. Malrith Duskblade stood on the upper balcony of the trading hall, his sharp gaze sweeping over the scene below like a predator surveying prey. The spider of Car was ready to spin his first web. "They are plotting against me," Malrith muttered, his voice barely audible over the din of trade negotiations echoing through the vast chamber. Behind him, Valrith Shadeborn leaned casually against a pillar, arms crossed. "The merchant guilds?" he asked, his tone dry. "Forgive me, my lord, but I didn't realize the spice traders were such a dire threat to your dominion." Malrith turned, his expression cold. "Do not mock me, Valrith. They are more than spice traders. They are parasites, feeding on the wealth of Car while conspiring to undermine noble houses like mine." Valrith raised an eyebrow. "Do you have proof of this grand conspiracy, or is this another one of your insights?" "Proof is unnecessary when the pattern is clear," Malrith snapped. "Do you think it's a coincidence that Lord Kalar has grown wealthier these past seasons, while my coffers have dwindled? The merchants serve him, funneling resources into his schemes. They must be dealt with." Valrith sighed, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "And how, exactly, do you intend to deal with them?" Malrith's lips curled into a smile. "We disrupt their dealings. A crucial trade agreement is set to be finalized tonight, one that would grant them access to a new route through the frozen wastes. If this agreement is sabotaged, their plans will crumble, and their loyalty to Kahala will be exposed." Valrith regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Sabotage a trade route. Simple enough, I suppose. And when this doesn't go the way you imagine, I assume you'll have another web ready to weave." Malrith's smile didn't waver. "This will go exactly as I imagine, Valrith. You'll see." That evening, the trading hall emptied as the merchants gathered in a shadowy chamber to finalize their deal. Malrith and Valrith waited in a concealed alcove, cloaked in darkness. Below them, the leaders of the guilds argued over terms, their voices low and venomous. "There," Malrith whispered, pointing to a scroll laid out on the table. "The contract. Once it is destroyed, they will turn on each other like starving beasts." Valrith glanced at the scroll and then at Malrith. "And how do you plan to get close enough to destroy it? Simply walking in and setting it on fire might ruin the subtlety of your grand web." Malrith pulled a vial of alchemical fire from his cloak, the liquid inside glowing faintly. "A small distraction is all we need. Once they are in disarray, we strike." Valrith's smirk returned, but he said nothing, stepping back as Malrith prepared. The noble tossed the vial expertly, its contents splattering against a brazier near the table. Flames erupted, leaping across the room as the merchants scrambled back in shock and panic. "Now," Malrith hissed, descending from the alcove with practiced speed. He reached the table, seized the contract, and tore it in half before casting the pieces into the fire. The merchants shouted in outrage, some drawing blades, others pointing accusingly at one another. Satisfied, Malrith retreated to the alcove, his heart racing with triumph. "It's done," he said, grinning at Valrith. "They'll be at each other's throats by dawn." Valrith's expression remained neutral. "Let's hope you're right." By morning, the repercussions of Malrith's sabotage began to unfold, though not in the way he had envisioned. Instead of turning on each other, the merchant guilds banded together, furious at the disruption of their deal. Their wrath was not directed at Lord Kalar, as Malrith had hoped, but at the noble houses they blamed for the chaos, his house chief among them. Worse, the trade route had been a source of income for Malrith's own holdings, and its loss sent his finances into a tailspin. Malrith sat in his study, staring at a ledger filled with damning numbers. His coffers were nearly empty, and the guilds were demanding restitution he couldn't afford to pay. Valrith stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Well," Valrith said after a long silence that went about as well as I expected. Malrith glared at him. This is a minor setback. The guild's true loyalties will reveal themselves in time. Malrith chuckled softly. If you say so, my lord. Though I suggest you focus on rebuilding your web before it collapses entirely. Malrith said nothing, his mind racing. He would recover, he had to. The spider of Karankar was not so easily undone, but as he stared at the empty ledger, a shadow of doubt began to creep into his thoughts. For the first time, the web he had spun felt more like a noose tightening around his own neck. Chapter 4. Enemies Everywhere. Malrith paced his study like a caged predator, the long hem of his cloak trailing across the cold obsidian floor. The flickering light from the sorceress braziers cast jagged shadows on the walls, mirroring the storm raging in his mind. A crumpled letter lay on the desk, its broken seal bearing the emblem of House Kalar, a coiled black serpent. This, Malrith growled, gesturing to the letter, is proof. Malrith Shadeborn leaned lazily against a pillar, arms crossed, his sharp features bathed in the dim light. Proof of what exactly? That Kalar exists. That he had the audacity to send correspondence. Truly damning evidence, my lord. Malrith's glare could have stripped flesh from bone. Do not mock me, Malrith. This letter, this farce of diplomacy, reeks of his treachery. He writes to feign civility, while he conspires to destroy me. Malrith straightened, letting out a soft sigh. Forgive my impertinence, but are you certain you're not perhaps reading too much into this? Kalar is powerful, yes, but why would he waste his time on you when he has larger rivals to contend with? Malrith slammed his fist against the desk, the impact sending the crumpled letter tumbling to the floor. Because he sees what I am building. He knows I am not like the others. He fears the web I am weaving, fears the day when his own holdings will fall to my schemes. Malrith bent to retrieve the letter, smoothing it out with deliberate slowness. His scarred face betrayed no emotion as he read aloud, to Malrith Duskblade, noble of Karankar. I extend my regards and hope this missive finds you in good health. May our houses remain in amicable standing as we continue to navigate these turbulent times. He glanced up, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Yes, I can see how this is clearly a declaration of war. You are blind if you cannot see the venom in his words, Malrith snapped, snatching the letter from Malrith's hands. Amicable standing? Turbulent times? He mocks me. He disguises his threat as politeness, but the intent is clear. Kalar means to destroy me, just as he has crushed every other house that stood in his way. Malrith tilted his head, regarding Malrith with something akin to pity. And what, precisely, do you intend to do about it? March on his stronghold with the mighty army you don't have? Or perhaps send another vial of alchemical fire to sabotage his granary? Malrith's lips curled into a predatory smile. I will outmaneuver him. Kalar's power lies in his wealth, his alliances. But alliances can be broken, and wealth can be stolen. Malrith raised an eyebrow. Stealing from Kalar? Bold. Suicidal but bold. It is not stealing, Malrith corrected, his tone dripping with condescension. It is strategic reallocation. His resources will be redirected to a nobler cause, my rise to power. With his coffers weakened, his allies will abandon him, and his reputation will crumble. Malrith exhaled sharply, pushing off the pillar to pace the room. My lord, listen to reason. Kalar is no fool. He has survived decades in the viper's nest of Karankar, and he's done so by being twice as ruthless as his rivals. If you provoke him, he will retaliate, and when he does, it won't be with polite letters. Malrith's eyes narrowed. Are you afraid of him, Malrith? The corsair stopped mid-step, his expression hardening. I fear nothing, but I've lived long enough to know when the odds are stacked too high, and this is a fight you cannot win. You underestimate me, Malrith said, his voice low and cold. Kalar is overconfident, complacent. He thinks his position is unassailable, but that arrogance will be his downfall. Malrith shook his head. And if you're wrong, if he crushes you like he's crushed everyone else who's crossed him, then I will fall as a predator, not as prey, Malrith said, his smile returning. But I will not fall, Malrith. The spider of Karankar does not falter. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them as sharp as a drawn blade. Finally, Malrith turned away, his voice heavy with resignation. "Very well, my lord. If you insist on this madness, I will stand by your side. But do not mistake my loyalty for approval." Malrith watched as Malrith left the room, his boots echoing down the hall. Alone once more, he returned to the desk, his hands brushing over the letter as if it were a trophy. In his mind, Keeler's fall was already unfolding. A chain of events so perfect, so precise, that the rival noble would have no escape. "Enemies everywhere," Malrith murmured to himself, his grin widening, "but none who can match the spider's web." He folded the letter neatly, placing it in a drawer alongside the other pieces of his growing puzzle. The game had begun, and Malrith Duskblade was determined to emerge as its victor, no matter the cost. Chapter 5. Dulcinea of the Shadows. The first time Malrith laid eyes on Solaris Nightthorn, he felt the threads of his web tighten, as though Cain himself had plucked them to signal her arrival. She was seated in the throne-like chair of her chamber, a figure of unparalleled grace and menace. Her dark robes shimmered like liquid shadow, and her crimson lips curved in the faintest semblance of a smile as she regarded him. Her beauty was cold, perfect, and utterly devastating, like the edge of a poisoned blade. Malrith inhaled sharply, his heart quickening. She was no mere sorceress, she was power incarnate, a vision of perfection that demanded reverence. He could sense the raw magic that clung to her like a second skin, a force both intoxicating and terrifying. When she spoke, her voice was smooth and melodic, but it carried a sharpness that cut deeper than any blade. "Malrith Duskblade," she said, her tone neither warm nor cold. "To what do I owe the honor of your visit?" Malrith bowed deeply, his mind racing to craft the perfect response. "Lady Nightthorn," he began, his voice as smooth as silk, "I sought your wisdom on a matter of great importance. Few possess the insight you do, and I would be remiss to act without your counsel." Her crimson eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest flicker of amusement dancing across her face. "Flattery, Malrith. I expected better from a Duskblade." Her words stung, but Malrith forced a smile. This was a test, a game of words and wit, and he would not fail. "Not flattery, my lady," he replied, "merely the truth. Your reputation as a master of sorcery and intrigue precedes you. Who better to guide me in navigating the treacheries of Kar? Solaris leaned back in her chair, resting her chin on her delicate fingers. For a long moment she said nothing, her gaze boring into him, as though dissecting his very soul. Finally she gave a small, dismissive wave of her hand. "Speak, then. What troubles you so greatly that you seek me out?" Malrith launched into a carefully rehearsed explanation of his rivalry with Keeler the Black, painting himself as a victim of treachery and deceit. He wove a tale of betrayal and ambition, embellishing just enough to elicit sympathy, or so he believed. Solaris listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she tilted her head slightly. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about this? Should I summon a tempest to destroy your enemy, or perhaps curse him to wander the void?" Malrith smiled, shaking his head. "I would never presume to ask for such a boon, my lady. I seek only your guidance. With your wisdom I can ensure Keeler's schemes unravel before him. Together we could." His words faltered as her smile widened, but it was not a kind smile. It was a predator's smile, the kind that showed teeth. "Together?" she repeated, her voice dripping with amusement. "You think yourself my equal, Malrith? Or perhaps you fancy yourself more than that?" Malrith felt a flush creep across his cheeks, but he quickly masked it with a bow. "Forgive me, my lady. I spoke out of turn." Solaris rose from her chair, gliding toward him with a grace that was almost inhuman. She stopped mere inches away, her crimson eyes locking onto his. "You are ambitious, I'll grant you that. But ambition without strength is like a blade without an edge, useless." Malrith held her gaze, willing himself not to flinch. "Then sharpen me, my lady. Show me the path to power, and I will prove myself worthy of your favor." She laughed, a sound that was both beautiful and cruel. "Worthy of my favor," she said, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. You mistake my amusement for interest, Duskblade. But very well. If you wish to play the game, I will indulge you for now. Her words sent a thrill through him, despite the chill in her tone. He straightened, his confidence renewed. You will not regret this, my lady. Perhaps, she said, turning away. Or perhaps you will be the one to regret it. Time will tell. When Malrith left her chambers, his mind was aflame with possibilities. He replayed their conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every glance, every flicker of her expression. She had challenged him. Yes, but there had been a subtle warmth beneath her cold exterior. She had seen his potential, he was certain of it. She is testing me, he muttered to himself as he walked the dark corridors of his keep. She wants to see if I am worthy, and I will prove that I am. Malrith was waiting for him in the shadows near his study. The Corsair stepped forward, his expression guarded. How did it go? He asked. Malrith smiled, his excitement barely contained. She sees my worth. She recognizes what I can become. It will take time, but Serpents Nightthorn will stand at my side. Malrith's brow furrowed. You're serious. Malrith, she's toying with you. Serpents doesn't stand at the side of anyone. She uses people and discards them when they're no longer useful. Malrith waved a hand dismissively. You don't understand, Malrith. She is different. She sees the grand design, the potential in our union. Together, we will reshape Karankar. Malrith sighed, shaking his head. Or she'll twist you into a pawn and use you to further her own schemes. Malrith's smile faded slightly, but his resolve remained firm. You doubt me now, but you'll see. Serpents and I are destined to rule the shadows of this city. She may not know it yet, but she will. As he retreated to his study, Malrith felt a renewed sense of purpose. The spider of Karankar had found his queen, and no web was too intricate, no scheme too dangerous to win her favor. Little did he know the queen was already weaving a web of her own, and he was caught in its center. Chapter 6. The Whisperer's Trap. The parchment trembled in Malrith's hand, though whether it was from excitement or anger, he could not tell. The missive was unsigned, its script elegant and precise. Every word seemed to pulse with significance, each stroke of ink a whisper in a web of intrigue that surrounded him. Kilar harbors rebellion in his midst, it read. He gathers strength not for the Witch King's glory, but for his own. Strike before he does, or be consumed in his ambition. Malrith paced his study, the letter crumpling slightly under his tightening grip. It confirmed everything he had suspected. Kilar the Black was not merely a rival. He was a traitor, a festering blight upon Naggaroth. If Malrith exposed him, it would not only secure his own survival but elevate him in the eyes of his peers. Perhaps even Malekith himself would take notice. Yet there was a catch, a nagging doubt that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The letter's source was unknown, and while its contents resonated with his suspicions, there was no guarantee of its veracity. Does it matter? Malrith whispered to himself, his voice low and sharp. Truth is irrelevant. Perception is all that matters in this game. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he barked. Malrith stepped into the room, his ever-present smirk firmly in place. Another late-night conspiracy session, my lord. I trust you're weaving something particularly grand this time? Malrith thrust the letter toward him. Read this. It confirms everything I've been saying about Kilar. Malrith's eyes flicked over the parchment. When he finished, he handed it back without a word, his expression unreadable. Well? Malrith demanded. Malrith leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. It's convenient, don't you think? This letter shows up out of nowhere, telling you exactly what you want to hear. Doesn't that strike you as suspicious? Suspicious? Malrith scoffed, pacing again. It's proof that Kilar's ambitions extend beyond our petty rivalries. He plots rebellion, Malrith, against the Witch King himself. And you're sure this isn't someone else's plot? Malrith pressed. Think, Malrith. Who benefits if you charge headlong into a confrontation with Kilar? Solaris. The name escaped Malrith's lips before he could stop it. Malrith raised an eyebrow. Ah, of course. The ever-enigmatic Lady Nightthorn. Let me guess, she was the one who delivered this letter to you. No, Malrith snapped, his tone defensive. She had nothing to do with this. The source is anonymous. Vaelrith's smirk widened, and yet her name was the first to come to mind. Interesting. Malrith ignored him, his mind racing. Was it possible that Solaris had orchestrated this? She had much to gain from destabilizing Kilar's influence, and using Malrith as her instrument would shield her from any repercussions. But no. Solaris was his ally, his queen. She saw his potential, his brilliance. If she had sent the letter, it was not to manipulate him but to guide him. She wanted him to succeed, to claim his rightful place in Karan Kar. I don't care where it came from, Malrith said finally, his tone resolute. The message is clear. If Kilar truly harbors rebellion, he is a threat to all of us. I will not sit idly by and wait for him to make his move. Vaelrith sighed, shaking his head. You're determined, then? Fine. What's the plan? Malrith turned to face him, his eyes alight with purpose. We strike preemptively. A calculated raid to expose his treachery. We'll hit his supply depots, disrupt his trade routes, force his hand. When he retaliates, we'll have all the evidence we need to bring him down. Vaelrith frowned. And if you're wrong? If this letter is just a ploy to draw you into a trap? Malrith's smile returned, cold and confident. Then we'll weave a web of our own. If Kilar is innocent, we'll fabricate the proof of his guilt. Naggaroth is not ruled by truth, Vaelrith. It is ruled by perception. For a long moment, Vaelrith said nothing, his sharp eyes studying Malrith. Then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. Very well. Just remember, if you pull on a thread too hard, the whole web can unravel. That night, Malrith sat alone in his study, poring over maps and ledgers. The strike would need to be swift, precise, and utterly devastating. Kilar's strength was formidable, but Malrith's cunning would be his undoing. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to Solaris. Had she sent the letter? The question lingered, unanswered but persistent. If she had, it only proved her brilliance and her faith in him. She was testing him, guiding him toward greatness. Together, he murmured, his lips curling into a smile, we will bring Kilar to his knees. But in the shadows of her own tower, Solaris Nightthorn smiled as well. The first strand of her web had been cast, and Malrith, her ambitious little pawn, had ensnared himself beautifully. Chapter 7. The Mercenary Gambit. The mercenary captain was an imposing figure, his armor battered but functional, his blade sheathed at his side like an unspoken threat. Scars ran across his face, a testament to his years spent raiding the coasts and spilling blood for coin. Malrith eyed him from across the shadowed chamber, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering glow of the torches lining the walls. Captain Drelzar, Malrith said smoothly, gesturing for the man to sit. Your reputation precedes you. A veteran of countless raids, a man who values coin over loyalty, qualities I find quite useful. Drelzar chuckled darkly, folding his arms instead of sitting. And you, Lord Duskblade, are a noble of modest holdings and an even more modest reputation. What makes you think you can afford my services? Malrith ignored the slight, leaning back in his chair with an air of practiced confidence. Because I pay in more than gold, Captain. What I offer is opportunity, an investment in the future. Ally yourself with me, and you will not merely survive in Naggaroth's cutthroat world, you will thrive. Drelzar raised an eyebrow. Bold words, but boldness doesn't pay my men, and it doesn't fill my coffers. Malrith's smile widened, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. Gold will come, Captain. My rival, Kilar the Black, has grown fat on ill-gotten riches. When we strike, his coffers will be ours, his assets seized and distributed to those who stand with me. Drelzar considered this, his scarred face betraying nothing. You're asking me to take a gamble. If this Kilar is as powerful as you say, failure means death, for both of us. Failure, Malrith said, his voice low and deliberate, is not an option. I have studied Kilar, his movements, his weaknesses. His strength lies in his overconfidence, and that will be his undoing. With your men at my side, we can strike where he least expects it, and when the dust settles, the rewards will be beyond your wildest imaginings. Drelzar's lips curled into a grin, though it lacked warmth. Very well, Lord Duskblade. My men will fight for you for now. But let me be clear, if you cannot deliver on your promises, you will find yourself with far more enemies than just Kalar. Malrith inclined his head, the smile never leaving his face. Agreed. You will not regret this decision, Captain. Later that night, as the mercenaries dispersed to their makeshift camp, Malrith entered Malrith's study, his expression dark. You've outdone yourself this time, my lord, promising a band of cutthroats riches you don't have. Truly inspired. Malrith waved a hand dismissively, pouring himself a goblet of dark wine. Details, Malrith. The gold is inconsequential. Once Kalar falls, there will be more than enough to satisfy them. Malrith snorted, stepping closer. And if Kalar doesn't fall, what happens when these mercenaries realize you can't pay them? They won't need to, Malrith said, his tone calm. By the time they question my ability to pay, we will have already struck. Victory breeds loyalty, Malrith, even among hired blades. Once they see what I am capable of, they will follow me willingly. Malrith's sharp gaze lingered on him for a moment. You're gambling with lives, ours, theirs, and everyone caught in the crossfire. If this goes wrong— It won't, Malrith interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. He turned to face Malrith fully, his dark eyes alight with fervor. Do you doubt me, Malrith? Do you doubt the spider's web? Malrith held his gaze, his expression unreadable. I doubt many things, Malrith, but I doubt you least of all. Malrith smiled, taking a long sip of wine. Good. Then prepare yourself. The time for hesitation is over. Kalar's downfall begins now. As the night deepened, Malrith sat alone in his study, poring over maps and ledgers. The mercenaries were a necessary risk, a tool to be wielded and discarded once their purpose was fulfilled. Their loyalty was irrelevant, only their blades mattered. But even as he planned, a small, nagging voice whispered at the edges of his mind. It was Malrith's voice, echoing his doubts and warnings. For a brief moment, Malrith hesitated, his confidence wavering. Then he crushed the thought, setting his goblet down with a decisive clang. This is the way of Naggaroth, he told himself. The strong prevail, and the weak perish. I am the spider, and my web will ensnare them all, Kalar, the mercenaries, even Malrith. The thought brought a cold smile to his lips. Let them doubt him. Let them question his methods. In the end, they would all see the brilliance of his vision. And by the time they realized the truth, it would be far too late to escape the web. Chapter 8. A Grand Shmi. A Minor Victory. The cold wind of Naggaroth howled like a chorus of the damned as Malrith surveyed the scene from the crest of a jagged ridge. Below, a convoy of supply wagons crept along a frostbitten path, their wheels crunching over ice. The wagons were laden with goods, spices, slaves, weapons, all bound for Kalar the Black's holdings. They were escorted by a handful of guards clad in dark armor, their pikes glinting under the pale light of Morsleb. Malrith's breath misted in the frigid air as he turned to his assembled force. The mercenaries stood ready, their mismatched armor and ragged cloaks marking them as killers for hire rather than disciplined soldiers. Malrith stood among them, arms crossed, his expression as cold as the wind. This is the beginning, Malrith said, his voice rising above the wind. Kalar's strength lies in his resources, and tonight we cut them away. Without his supplies, his power will crumble, and the vultures will descend upon him. A murmur ran through the group, half-hearted at best. Malrith ignored it, gesturing toward the convoy below. Strike swiftly, leave no survivors, and take everything. Tonight, we make the first move in a war that will end with Kalar's ruin. Malrith stepped forward, his voice low enough that only Malrith could hear. Are you sure about this? A single raid won't topple Kalar, and if he traces this back to you. He won't, Malrith interrupted, his tone sharp. By the time he realizes what's happening, it will be too late. Now, follow your orders or step aside. Malrith's eyes lingered on him for a moment before he nodded and fell back into line. The attack was swift and brutal. Malrith watched from the ridge as his mercenaries descended upon the convoy like shadows given form. The guards barely had time to react before they were overwhelmed, their screams swallowed by the icy night. Within moments the wagons were ablaze, the supplies they carried reduced to ash and ruin. Slaves were freed, or taken by the mercenaries as their own spoils, and the survivors of Kalar's escort were left to die in the frozen wilderness. Malrith descended from his perch, his heart pounding with exhilaration. He strode through the wreckage, his boots crunching over broken wood and frozen blood. The scent of burning spices and charred flesh filled the air, a perfume of victory. "Efficient," he said, addressing Drelzar, the mercenary captain. "You have earned your payment tonight, Captain." Drelzar shrugged, his expression unreadable. "A job's a job. But don't fool yourself, my lord. This was a skirmish, not a victory. Kalar will recover." Malrith's smile faltered slightly. Not this time. This was no ordinary supply line. It was the lifeblood of his operation. Without it, his holdings will crumble, and his allies will abandon him. Drelzar didn't respond, but Malrith, standing nearby, gave a soft chuckle. "Let's hope you're right, because if you're not, Kalar's retaliation will be swift and far more brutal than this." Malrith turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "You doubt me again, Malrith." "I doubt everyone," Malrith replied, his smirk faint. "It's how I've stayed alive this long." Malrith said nothing, his gaze lingering on Malrith before he turned back to the burning wreckage. He wouldn't let doubt seep into his thoughts, not now, not when his plans were finally in motion. The next day, word of the raid spread through Kar like wildfire. The destruction of Kalar's supply line was whispered about in the shadowed halls of the city, and for a brief moment, Malrith allowed himself to savor the attention. But the victory was short-lived. Reports began to trickle in. Kalar's forces were regrouping, his operations continuing with barely a pause. It seemed the supply line, while significant, was only one of many. Kalar's power remained intact, and his attention had turned sharply toward finding the perpetrator of the attack. Malrith stood in his study, gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. "It wasn't enough," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "How could it not be enough?" Malrith, seated casually on the windowsill, raised an eyebrow. "Because you underestimated him. Again. Kalar didn't build his empire on a single supply line. He has contingencies, redundancies. If you want to hurt him, you'll have to do a lot more than burn a few wagons." Malrith whirled on him, his expression fierce. "You think I don't know that? This was just the beginning." Malrith shrugged, his smirk returning. "Then I hope your next move is better thought out, because Kalar knows someone is coming for him now, and he'll be watching." Malrith turned back to the desk, his mind racing. The raid had been a minor victory, but it had revealed something crucial: Kalar's resilience. If Malrith was to succeed, he would need to strike deeper, harder, and faster than before. But even as he plotted his next move, a sliver of doubt crept into his thoughts. For the first time, he wondered if he was the one ensnared in the web, his own or someone else's. Shaking the thought away, he straightened, his resolve hardening. "Let him watch," he said quietly. "The spider always has another strand to spin." And in the dark corners of Kalar, Kalar the Black began to prepare his retaliation. Chapter 9. The Black Spire. The dark silhouette of Kalar's fortress loomed on the horizon like a monolith carved from the nightmares of Naggaroth. Its spires pierced the storm-laden sky, jagged and cruel, their obsidian surfaces reflecting the pale green glow of more sleep. This was the Black Spire, Kalar's seat of power, a fortress that had weathered countless assaults and outlived its challengers. For Malrith Duskblade, it was a symbol of arrogance, one that was long overdue for its fall. He stood atop a frostbitten ridge, his mercenaries arrayed below him in a sea of dark armor and sharpened steel. The icy wind bit at his face, but he barely felt it, his blood aflame with ambition. This was his moment, the culmination of his scheming, the stroke that would shatter Kalar's hold over Kar and cement Malrith's place as its true power. "Tonight," he called out, his voice carrying over the wind, "the Black Spire falls. Kalar the Black has ruled through fear and treachery for too long. His strength is a facade, and we will expose it for what it truly is." The mercenaries murmured in agreement, though their enthusiasm was muted. They had followed Malrith this far for promises of riches and glory, but the sight of the fortress before them, and the stories that surrounded it, had dampened their spirits. Malrith Shadeborn stood nearby, his arms crossed, his expression as unreadable as ever. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low enough that only Malrith could hear. "Killur isn't some petty lord. He's a seasoned warrior with an army at his command. Marching on his stronghold might be ambitious." Malrith turned to him, his dark eyes blazing with conviction. "It's more than ambition, Velrith. It's destiny. Killar's time is over, and mine is just beginning." Velrith tilted his head, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. "Destiny, right? Well, I hope you're prepared for the part where destiny fights back." Malrith ignored him, raising a hand to signal the advance. The mercenaries began their march, their footsteps crunching through the snow as they descended the ridge. Malrith followed, his heart pounding with anticipation. The attack began under the cover of darkness. Malrith's forces surged toward the black spire, their approach silent save for the hiss of steel being drawn. The outer walls were manned by a sparse contingent of guards, their torches bobbing like fireflies in the gloom. "Pathetic," Malrith muttered, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Killur underestimates me." The first wave of mercenaries reached the walls and scaled them with grappling hooks, their movements swift and practiced. Within moments, the outer defenses were breached, and the gates swung open, allowing the rest of the force to flood in. Malrith strode through the gates like a conqueror, his cloak billowing behind him. The courtyard was eerily silent, the only sounds the crackle of torches and the shuffle of boots on stone. "Too easy," Velrith murmured, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. Malrith shot him a sharp glance. "Do not mistake efficiency for weakness. Killur's arrogance will be his undoing." As if in response, a deafening horn sounded from deep within the fortress. The sound reverberated through the air, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. Malrith froze, his triumph turning to unease. From the shadows of the inner walls, armored figures began to emerge, dozens at first, then hundreds. They moved with precision, their ranks unbroken, their weapons gleaming with a menacing light. "Killur's army?" Velrith said, his voice low. Before Malrith could respond, a figure stepped forward from the opposing force. Clad in dark armor adorned with serpentine motifs, Killur the Black was every bit as imposing as the rumors suggested. His crimson eyes locked onto Malrith, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "So," Killur called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "the spider finally leaves his web. Tell me, Malrith, did you really think you could challenge me?" Malrith gritted his teeth, drawing his blade. "You underestimate me, Killur. This night will mark your end." Killur laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "Oh, I don't underestimate you. I simply recognize what you truly are, a fool, chasing a dream that will never be yours." He raised his hand, and with a single command his forces charged. The battle was chaos. Malrith's mercenaries fought valiantly, their blades clashing against Killur's disciplined soldiers, but they were hopelessly outmatched. For every enemy they felled, two more rose to take their place. Malrith fought at the center of the fray, his blade flashing as he cut down any who dared to approach him. But even as he struck his enemies down, the tide of the battle was undeniable. "This isn't a battle," Velrith shouted over the din, his blade slick with blood. "It's a slaughter. We need to retreat." "Never," Malrith roared, his voice hoarse. "This is my moment. We cannot." A massive explosion of force sent him sprawling to the ground. Killur stood above him, his sword dripping with blood, his smile as cold as the Naggaroth night. "Your moment," Killur sneered, raising his blade. "Ends now." Before the killing blow could fall, Velrith appeared, blocking the strike with his own blade. "Enough," he snarled, shoving Killur back. He grabbed Malrith by the arm, hauling him to his feet. "We're leaving. Now." The retreat was harrowing. Malrith's forces were decimated, and those who survived scattered into the wilderness. By the time Malrith and Velrith reached the safety of the frozen wastes, the Black Spire was little more than a distant shadow. Malrith sank to his knees, his breath ragged, his pride shattered. "You were warned," Velrith said, his voice devoid of malice. "You should have listened." Malrith said nothing, his mind a storm of fury and shame. He had overreached, underestimated his enemy, and paid the price. But even as he sat there, surrounded by the ruins of his ambition, a single thought burned in his mind. The spider weaves again. Chapter 10. A Rude Awakening. The icy winds of Naggaroth bit at Malrith's face as he and Velrith approached the gates of Kar. The jagged spires of the city loomed above them, cruel and indifferent, a reflection of the society that thrived within. Each step toward the gates felt heavier than the last, the weight of his failure pressing down on him like a physical burden. By the time they reached the city's shadowed streets, Malrith's armor was caked with frost, his cloak tattered and stained with the blood of the mercenaries who had perished under his command. His body bore no injuries, but his pride had been savaged beyond recognition. He clutched the hilt of his sword tightly, his knuckles white, as though it were the only thing holding him together. The mockery begins. The whispers began almost immediately. Dark elf courtiers and merchants paused in their dealings to watch him pass, their expressions a mixture of scorn and amusement. "Is that Duskblade?" one noblewoman murmured to her companion, loud enough for Malrith to hear. "The one who marched on the Black Spire," her companion replied, his voice dripping with mockery. "They say Kellar barely lifted a finger to rout him. Perhaps he mistook a skirmish for a siege." Laughter followed, sharp and cutting. Malrith's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to keep walking, his head held high. Velrith, trailing just behind him, sighed audibly. "You're the talk of the city, my lord. Congratulations. I suppose infamy is better than obscurity." Malrith shot him a glare over his shoulder. "Spare me your wit, Velrith. I have no patience for it today." "You've had no patience for it since we left the Black Spire," Velrith replied, his tone calm but pointed. "Perhaps you should reflect on why that is." The return to the Duskblade estate. By the time they reached the crumbling estate of House Duskblade, Malrith's composure was fraying. The mocking stares and snide comments had followed him through every corner of the city. He slammed the heavy doors of the main hall behind him, his breath ragged with suppressed fury. "This is temporary," he muttered, pacing the room like a caged beast. "The city can mock me, but they will see. Kellar may have won this battle, but the war is far from over." Velrith leaned against a pillar, his arms crossed, watching Malrith with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "The war, you say? My lord, forgive my impertinence, but you have no army, no allies, and no gold. Unless you plan to defeat Kellar with sheer force of will, I suggest reconsidering." Malrith stopped pacing, turning to face Velrith with a glare that could have melted ice. "You doubt me, Velrith? After everything we've been through?" Velrith's smirk faded, his tone softening. "I don't doubt your resolve, Malrith, but I wonder if you see the reality of our situation. Naggaroth doesn't forgive weakness, and right now, you're vulnerable. That makes me vulnerable." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken truths. "Leave, then," Malrith said finally, his voice low but cold. "If your loyalty falters, I have no use for you." Velrith sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Loyalty isn't the problem. It's your stubbornness. You're so consumed by this idea of destiny that you can't see the edge of the cliff you're standing on." Malrith's expression softened for the briefest moment, but he quickly turned away, unwilling to show weakness. "Do as you please, Velrith. Stay, leave, it makes no difference to me." Velrith watched him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're a fool, Malrith, but I've followed worse fools. I'll stay for now. Someone has to keep you alive, if only to see how this madness ends." The spider's resolve. That night, as the estate grew silent, Malrith sat alone in his study, staring at the flickering flames of the hearth. His failure at the Black Spire replayed in his mind, a haunting specter that refused to leave him in peace. The laughter, the scorn, the look of triumph on Kellar's face, It all gnawed at him, feeding the fire of his anger. But beneath the anger was something else, something colder and sharper. "Let them mock me," he whispered to the empty room. "Let them think I am broken." He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edges of the desk. The spider is not defeated. The web is not undone. This is merely a thread, a single thread in a tapestry they cannot begin to comprehend. His lips curled into a cold smile, his resolve hardening like tempered steel. Killer will fall. They all will, and when they do, they will remember the name Malrith Duskblade, not with laughter, but with fear. In the shadows of the room, Malrith watched from the doorway, unseen. He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Madness," he muttered under his breath. "But madness is better than despair." He turned and walked away, leaving Malrith alone with his thoughts and his ambitions. The spider was wounded, yes, but a wounded spider is all the more dangerous. Chapter 11. The Puppet of Nightthorn. The air in Malrith's study was thick with the scent of burned incense, a bitter aroma meant to sharpen the mind and drive away despair. He needed both now more than ever. The wounds of his failed campaign still stung, and the whispers in the halls of Cairn Carr had grown louder, more mocking. Each day brought a fresh reminder of his humiliation. Yet he sat upright at his desk, his hands clasped as if in prayer, his dark eyes scanning the maps and ledgers spread before him. There was no time for despair. The spider would rebuild his web. A soft knock broke his focus, the sound echoing through the silent chamber. Malrith frowned. Few dared disturb him now, not out of fear, but because his name had become a source of ridicule. "Enter," he commanded, his voice sharp. The door opened, and his breath caught in his throat. Silurus Nightthorn swept into the room like a shadow given form, her presence filling the space with an almost tangible weight. Her dark robes clung to her slender frame, shimmering faintly as though woven from starlight. Her crimson eyes glinted with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, something unknowable. "Lady Nightthorn," Malrith said, rising from his chair. He smoothed his cloak, willing his voice to remain steady. "To what do I owe the honor?" Silurus gave a faint smile, her lips curving in a way that was both alluring and predatory. "Do I need a reason to visit, Malrith? Perhaps I simply wished to see how my ambitious little spider is faring." Her words stung, though her tone was light. He forced a smile, gesturing to the seat across from him. "You flatter me, my lady. Please sit." She moved with a grace that was almost unnatural, settling into the chair with an air of effortless superiority. "The city speaks of you," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "Your march on the Black Spire has become the latest tale in Cairn Carr's sordid tapestry." Malrith's smile faltered. "They mock me," he said bitterly. "They see only the failure, not the vision behind it." Silurus tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what is your vision, Malrith? Tell me." He hesitated for a moment, but the intensity of her gaze compelled him to speak. "I see a Cairn Carr freed from the tyranny of men like Kellar, a city where strength is not measured by brute force, but by cunning, by strategy. My failure at the Black Spire was a misstep. Yes, but it has taught me much. The next move will be different." Silurus leaned forward slightly, her smile widening. "Ambitious as ever. That is why I find you so intriguing, Malrith. You dream of a Naggaroth that others cannot even imagine." Her words sent a thrill through him, though he fought to keep his composure. "Dreams are useless without action," he said. "I will make that vision a reality." "Of that I have no doubt," she replied, her voice low and honeyed. "But even the most cunning spider needs help weaving its web." Malrith's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying, my lady?" "I am saying," she said, rising gracefully from her chair, "that you do not have to face your enemies alone. I have watched you, Malrith, and I see potential in you, a spark that could grow into a flame, if properly tended." She moved closer to him, her presence intoxicating. "Let us align our interests. Together we can bring Kellar to his knees. I have resources, knowledge, power. All I ask in return is your loyalty." Malrith stared at her, his mind racing. This was what he had dreamed of, an alliance with one of Cairn Carr's most powerful sorceresses. With Silurus at his side, his enemies would tremble. But a small voice, one that sounded disturbingly like Malrith, whispered in the back of his mind, "Why would she ally with you? What does she stand to gain?" He pushed the thought aside, rising to his feet. "You honor me, Lady Nightthorn. If you truly wish to stand with me, then I accept your offer." Her smile deepened, and for a brief moment, Malrith thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, something predatory, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Wise as well as ambitious," she said, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "I knew I chose well." After Silurus left, Malrith sat alone in his study, replaying their conversation in his mind. Her words had filled him with renewed purpose, but a nagging doubt lingered. Why had she chosen him? Malrith entered the room, his expression dark. "I saw her leave," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "What did she want?" An alliance," Malrith replied, his tone guarded. Malrith's eyes narrowed. "An alliance? With you? Don't take this the wrong way, but why would she bother?" Malrith glared at him. "Because she sees my potential, Malrith. She understands that I am destined for greatness." "Or she sees you as a useful tool," Malrith countered. "Silurus doesn't ally with anyone. She manipulates, she uses, and then she discards. Be careful, Malrith, or you'll find yourself tangled in her web." Malrith shook his head, rising from his chair. "You're wrong, Malrith. This is the opportunity we've been waiting for. With Silurus at my side, Kalar will fall, and Karen Carr will be ours." Malrith sighed, his expression unreadable. "If you say so, my lord. But don't come crying to me when the spider finds itself devoured by the snake." Malrith said nothing, turning back to his desk. He wouldn't let Malrith's cynicism poison his thoughts. This was his moment, his chance to reclaim what he had lost. Little did he know, the first strand of Silurus's web had already been spun, and he was the one caught in it. Chapter 12. Malrith's Warning. The Duskblade estate had grown darker in the days since Silurus Nightthorn entered Malrith's orbit. The once faded halls were now alive with shadows that seemed to shift of their own accord, their shapes whispering promises of power and danger. Silurus's influence was everywhere, in the magical wards that now adorned the walls, in the hushed voices of the few remaining servants, and most of all, in Malrith himself. Malrith Shadeborn observed it all with mounting unease. He leaned against the doorway of Malrith's study, arms crossed, his sharp gaze fixed on the noble who was now pacing like a caged beast, muttering under his breath about plans and strategies. "You're obsessed," Malrith said finally, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Malrith stopped mid-stride, turning to glare at him. "What did you say?" "I said," Malrith repeated, pushing off the doorframe, "that you're obsessed. This alliance with Silurus, whatever it is, it's consuming you." Malrith's eyes narrowed. "Silurus is the key to everything, Malrith. With her knowledge and power, we can finally bring Kalar down. Why can't you see that?" Malrith stepped forward, his voice low and measured. "I see plenty. I see a sorceress who has never done anything without a hidden motive. I see a man so desperate to reclaim his pride that he's willing to trust a serpent. And I see a web not yours, Malrith, but hers, and you're tangled in it." Malrith's lips curled into a sneer. "You're wrong. Silurus has offered me her support because she recognizes my potential. She sees what I am capable of, unlike you." Malrith's jaw tightened. "And what exactly does she stand to gain from this alliance? Have you asked yourself that? Do you really think she sees you as an equal? Malrith, you're a means to an end. She's using you." "That's enough," Malrith snapped, his voice echoing through the chamber. He stepped closer, his dark eyes burning with anger. "You doubt me at every turn, Malrith. You question my judgment, my plans, my alliances. Perhaps it is you who does not belong here." Malrith's expression hardened, his usual smirk absent. "You think I'm the problem? I've followed you through your schemes, your failures, your delusions. I've warned you time and again, and you've ignored me every time. But this is different. Silurus will destroy you if you let her." Malrith's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, though he did not draw it. You dare accuse me of weakness, of blindness. Perhaps it is you who harbors treachery in your heart. Malrith stared at him, the tension between them crackling like lightning. I have no treachery in my heart, Malrith. Only frustration. I stayed because I thought you could be something greater. But if you keep down this path, you'll lose everything, including me. For a moment, silence fell between them. Then Malrith turned away, his voice cold and dismissive. Do as you will, Malrith. If you lack the vision to see what lies ahead, I won't stop you from leaving. Malrith's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm. I'll stay, he said finally. Not for you, but because I'd like to see how this madness ends. But mark my words, Malrith, when Silurus turns on you, don't expect me to save you. Malrith didn't respond, his focus already returning to the plans spread across his desk. Malrith turned and left the study, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Alone in his study, Malrith stared down at the maps and documents before him, his mind a storm of emotions. Malrith's words gnawed at him, but he shoved them aside. He doesn't understand, Malrith thought bitterly. He has no vision, no ambition. Solaris is not the enemy, she is the answer. He leaned over the desk, his fingers tracing the lines of a map that detailed Kalar's holdings. He could feel the threads of his web tightening, the pieces falling into place. Malrith's doubts meant nothing. Solaris believed in him, and with her support, victory was inevitable. She sees what you cannot, Malrith whispered to himself. She understands what I am destined to become. When the time comes, even you will see. But in the shadows of her own tower, Solaris Nightthorn smiled, her crimson eyes alight with amusement. The threads of her own web were tightening, and Malrith, for all his ambition, was already ensnared. Chapter 13. The Phantom Coup. The chamber was quiet save for the crackling of the brazier, its flames casting flickering shadows across the maps and documents spread across the long, obsidian table. Malrith stood at its head, his gloved hand resting on a sheaf of parchment filled with scribbled plans and diagrams. His dark eyes gleamed with determination, and his lips curled into a confident smile. This is it, Malrith said, his voice low and charged with excitement. This is how we claim our rightful place. The ruling council has grown complacent, blind to their vulnerabilities. With Solaris's guidance, we can strike at their heart and seize power before they even realize what's happening. Malrith Shadeborn leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression one of resigned skepticism. A coup against the ruling council, he said dryly. Bold. Suicidal, but bold. Malrith ignored the jab, his excitement undimmed. It's not suicide. It's destiny. The council's hold on Karankar is tenuous. They rely on alliances and fear to maintain control. If we disrupt those alliances, expose their weaknesses, and strike swiftly, we can dismantle their power. Malrith sighed, shaking his head. And you're certain this will work because, what? Solaris whispered it to you over a goblet of wine. Malrith glared at him, his voice sharpening. Solaris has provided us with intelligence that confirms everything. The council is divided, their loyalty fractured. With her resources and my strategy, we cannot fail. Malrith pushed off the wall, stepping closer to the table. You're putting an awful lot of trust in a woman whose motives are murkier than the Harganeth swamps. Have you even considered the possibility that she's using you? She's guiding me, Malrith snapped. She sees my potential, Malrith. She believes in what we can achieve together. Or she sees you as a convenient pawn, Malrith muttered, though he didn't press the point further. Over the next several nights, Malrith worked tirelessly, weaving his schemes with an energy that bordered on obsession. He sent emissaries to sow discord among the council's allies, planted false rumors to destabilize key figures, and orchestrated small acts of sabotage to create the illusion of widespread rebellion. Malrith, despite his reservations, played his part. He carried messages, coordinated mercenaries, and even infiltrated one of the council's lesser holdings to gather intelligence. But all the while, his unease grew. It's too clean, Malrith said one night, as they reviewed the final stages of the plan. The council should have noticed by now, but they haven't made a move. Either they're utterly incompetent, or walking into a trap. Malrith waved a hand dismissively. They're paralyzed by fear and indecision. That's why this will work. When we strike, they won't have time to react. Malrith didn't argue, though his doubt lingered. The plan was audacious, yes, but it felt off. Too easy, too convenient. And the shadow of Solaris loomed large over everything. Every step of the plan bore her fingerprints, her whispered suggestions shaping Malrith's every move. The night of the coup arrived, the air in Kar thick with tension. Malrith's forces, a mixture of mercenaries and disillusioned house guards, moved through the city under the cover of darkness. Their target was the Black Council chamber, where the ruling lords gathered in secret to deliberate and scheme. Malrith led the charge, his cloak billowing behind him as he strode through the shadowed streets. Malrith followed at his side, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, his every step filled with wary caution. "This is it," Malrith said, his voice brimming with confidence. "Tonight the council falls. By dawn, Kar will be ours." They reached the council chamber without incident, their forces converging on the great doors. Malrith raised a hand, signaling for silence, then nodded to Malrith. Malrith hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, his blade gleaming in the dim light. He pushed the doors open, revealing the chamber beyond. It was empty. Malrith froze, his mind racing to make sense of the scene. The chamber was silent, its torches burning low. There were no guards, no council members, nothing. "What is this?" Malrith muttered, stepping inside. A slow clap echoed through the chamber, the sound sending a chill down his spine. From the shadows, Kalar the Black emerged, his crimson eyes gleaming with triumph. "Malrith Duskblade," Kalar said, his voice cold and mocking. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice your little schemes? Did you truly believe you could outmaneuver me?" Malrith's blood ran cold as the trap snapped shut. Figures emerged from the shadows, Kalar's guards, Solaris herself, and members of the ruling council, their expressions a mixture of amusement and disdain. "You've been played," Malrith whispered, his tone grim. Malrith clenched his fists, his mind reeling. Solaris stepped forward, her crimson eyes meeting his, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Don't look so surprised, my dear," she said softly. "Did you truly think you were the one weaving the web?" The battle that followed was brief and brutal. Malrith's forces, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, were routed. He and Malrith barely escaped with their lives, fleeing through the labyrinthine streets of Kar as the city echoed with the sounds of their defeat. When they finally reached the safety of the Duskblade estate, Malrith collapsed into a chair, his chest heaving with exertion. His mind was a storm of fury and humiliation. "You were warned," Malrith said, his tone cutting. "But you wouldn't listen." Malrith glared at him, his voice trembling with rage. "I will not be lectured by you. This isn't over, Malrith. Not by a long shot." Malrith sighed, turning toward the door. "You're right about one thing, Malrith. It's not over. But if you keep trusting snakes, it will be soon enough." As Malrith left the room, Malrith stared into the flickering flames of the hearth, his mind already racing with plans for revenge. He had been outplayed, yes, but the spider was not finished. Not yet. Chapter 14. Mockery in the Council. The Black Council chamber loomed above Malrith like a mausoleum of ambition, its vaulted ceilings and jagged pillars designed to inspire awe and dread. Torches burned in iron sconces, their flames casting jagged shadows on the dark stone walls. The air was heavy with the scent of burning oils and the palpable tension of a dozen dark elf nobles gathered in one place. Malrith stood at the center of the chamber, his shoulders squared, his chin held high. Around him sat the ruling lords of Kar, their cold, calculating gazes fixed on him like predators sizing up a wounded animal. At the far end of the chamber, Kalar the Black sat upon an ornate throne of obsidian, his crimson eyes gleaming with undisguised amusement. This was Malrith's moment to reclaim his honor, to expose the corruption and incompetence of the council, to prove his worth as a force to be reckoned with in the treacherous halls of Naggaroth. He clenched his fists, steadying himself before he spoke. "My lords," Malrith began, his voice ringing out with carefully measured authority, "I have come before you not to plead, but to enlighten. The events of recent weeks, missteps though they may have been, were born of a vision greater than any one house. A vision of a stronger, unified Kar. His words hung in the air, met not with applause or murmurs of agreement, but with an icy silence. One of the nobles, a thin, sharp-faced woman draped in silken robes, tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "A unified Kar," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "Unified under whom, Lord Duskblade? Yourself, perhaps." Laughter rippled through the chamber, cruel and cutting. Malrith's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "I speak not of personal ambition, Lady Malrith, but of survival. Our enemies grow bolder each day. The Druchii cannot afford to be divided if we are to maintain our dominance." "And yet," Kelar interjected, his voice smooth and venomous, "it seems division is all you have brought us, Malrith. Your recent escapades have done little to inspire confidence in your so-called vision." More laughter. Malrith felt the heat rising to his face, but he pressed on. "I have made mistakes, yes, but mistakes are the price of ambition. Would you prefer inaction? Cowardice? Kelar may sit comfortably now, but how long before his failures become a threat to us all?" The room fell silent. For a moment Malrith thought he had struck a chord. But then Kelar leaned forward, his smile widening. "You accuse me of failure, yet it was you who marched on the Black Spire with no plan, no army, and no hope of victory," Kelar said. "It was you who rallied mercenaries with promises of wealth you could not deliver, and it is you who stands before us now, a man stripped of allies, reputation, and power." The council erupted into laughter, the sound echoing off the chamber walls. Malrith's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. He fought to keep his composure, to stand tall even as the weight of their scorn threatened to crush him. "You mock me now," Malrith said, his voice rising above the din, "but mockery is the refuge of the small-minded. When the enemies of the Druchii are at our gates, you will remember this day and wish you had heeded my warning." The laughter subsided, replaced by cold, calculating stares. Malrith rose from her seat, her expression one of feigned pity. "Spare us your melodrama, Lord Duskblade," she said. "The council has indulged your theatrics long enough. It is clear you are unfit to hold any position of influence within these halls." Malrith's heart sank. "You cannot." "We can," Kelar said, rising from his throne. "And we will. Effective immediately, your remaining lands and titles are forfeit. You are hereby stripped of all authority within Kar." The words hit Malrith like a blade to the chest. He staggered back, his vision swimming as the council erupted into murmurs of approval. Kelar stepped closer, his smile cold and triumphant. "Consider this mercy," Kelar said softly. "A lesser man would have ended your life, but I find your continued existence amusing." Malrith stumbled out of the council chamber, his mind a storm of rage and humiliation. The mocking laughter still echoed in his ears, mingling with the whispers of courtiers who lined the halls, their smirks and knowing glances driving the dagger deeper. Malrith was waiting for him outside, leaning casually against a pillar. He straightened as Malrith approached, his expression unreadable. "How did it go?" Malrith asked, though the answer was written plainly on Malrith's face. Malrith didn't respond, brushing past him and continuing down the corridor. Malrith followed, his tone softening. "They've taken everything, haven't they?" "They've taken nothing," Malrith hissed, his voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. "The council is blind, arrogant. They think they've won, but they haven't seen the last of me." Malrith sighed. "Malrith, you need to." "Enough," Malrith snapped, whirling to face him. "I will not listen to your doubts, Malrith. Not now, not ever. They think me defeated, but the spider is not so easily crushed." Malrith studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, but tread carefully, Malrith. A cornered spider spins its web desperately, and desperation leads to mistakes." Malrith turned away, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and resolve. He would rebuild. He would rise again. And when he did, the council would regret the day they crossed him. But as he walked into the shadows of Kar, the laughter of his enemies followed him like a curse. Chapter 15. Malrith's Choice. The halls of Kar were as treacherous as they were cold. Whispers echoed down the jagged corridors, promises and threats woven together in an endless dance of intrigue. Malrith Shadeborn moved through these halls with practiced ease, his scarred face betraying nothing. He had spent years navigating the venomous politics of Naggaroth. and while he had no love for the games nobles played, he had learned to survive them. Today, however, survival felt particularly bitter. He found himself in a private chamber, its walls adorned with banners bearing the coiled serpent emblem of House Malrith. The thin, sharp-faced noblewoman reclined in a high-backed chair, her pale fingers tapping idly on the armrest. A faint smile played on her lips, one that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "You could do better, Malrith," Malrith said, her voice as smooth as silk. "You've tied yourself to a sinking ship. Malrith Duskblade is a man undone, stripped of power, mocked by his peers, and clinging to delusions of grandeur. Why waste your talents on him?" Malrith remained standing, his arms crossed. "I didn't realize you'd taken such an interest in my career, Lady Malrith." Malrith's smile widened. "It's not just your career I find interesting. It's your potential. A man like you, pragmatic, resourceful, intelligent, has no place serving a failure like Malrith. Join me, Malrith. I can offer you what he never could, wealth, power, and a future free of the stench of desperation." Malrith tilted his head, considering her words. She wasn't wrong. Malrith's star had fallen, and dragging himself through the wreckage of his schemes was growing tiresome. Malrith, by contrast, was a rising force in Carn. Aligning with her would secure his position, perhaps even elevate it beyond what he had ever imagined. And yet, the thought left a sour taste in his mouth. "Tempting," he said after a moment, his voice neutral. "But what exactly would you have me do in your service?" "Whatever I require," Malrith replied smoothly. "I need someone who can move unseen, who can strike without hesitation, who can handle complications. You've proven yourself capable in that regard." Malrith chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "You want an attack dog." Malrith's eyes narrowed slightly. "I want a weapon. One with a mind sharp enough to know when to strike and when to hold. Malrith has dulled your edge, Malrith. Let me hone it." Malrith left Malrith's chamber without giving her an answer, her offer weighing heavily on his mind. The streets of Carn were alive with the murmur of the dark city, its shadows shifting as if alive. He wandered aimlessly, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and frustration. He thought of Malrith, his ambition, his arrogance, his endless schemes that seemed to lead nowhere. Loyalty to the Duskblade noble had brought Malrith little but trouble, and yet there was something about Malrith's determination, his refusal to bow, that kept drawing Malrith back. "He's a fool," Malrith muttered to himself, his voice lost in the cold wind. "A blind, delusional fool." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't the whole truth. Malrith was more than a fool, he was a dreamer, a man who dared to imagine a world where cunning could triumph over raw power. Malrith didn't share that vision, but he couldn't help but respect it. When he finally returned to the crumbling Duskblade estate, he found Malrith in the study, poring over a map with the intensity of a man plotting his next move. The sight was almost comical, Malrith, stripped of all power, still clinging to the fantasy of victory. "You're late," Malrith said without looking up. "I needed that report an hour ago." Malrith stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "I wasn't gathering reports. I was meeting with Lady Malrith." Malrith froze, his hand hovering over the map. Slowly he looked up, his dark eyes narrowing. "And what did she want?" "To steal me away from you," Malrith said bluntly. "She offered me power, wealth, and a future without your eccentricities." Malrith's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze turning cold. "And what did you tell her?" "I haven't told her anything," Malrith replied, leaning casually against the wall. "But I'm curious, Malrith, why should I stay? What do you have to offer me that she doesn't?" For a moment, Malrith said nothing, his gaze boring into Malrith's. Then, with a deep breath, he straightened, his expression hardening. "Because I don't just offer power or wealth, Malrith. I offer purpose. A chance to build something greater than yourself. Malrith is like the rest of them, scheming for scraps, content to play the same tired game. But I will change the game. And when I do, you'll want to be at my side." Malrith studied him, his expression unreadable. Finally he sighed, shaking his head. "You're mad, Malrith. completely and utterly mad. Malrith's lips curled into a faint smile. And yet you're still here. Malrith chuckled softly, though it was tinged with resignation. For now. But don't make me regret it. As Malrith left the study, Malrith returned to his map, his mind already racing with plans. He had no intention of letting Celereth or anyone else take what was his. The spider was down, yes, but not defeated. And with allies like Malrith, reluctant though they may be, he would rise again. In the shadows of the estate, Malrith lit a small pipe, the bitter smoke curling into the air. He wasn't sure why he had stayed, perhaps out of loyalty, or perhaps just to see how Malrith's madness would play out. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. Serving Malrith Duskblade was never going to be boring. Chapter 16. The Traitor's Blade. The faint scent of incense and blood lingered in the air as Malrith Duskblade stood in the dimly lit chamber of Celerith Nightthorn. The sorceress reclined in her throne-like chair, her crimson eyes fixed on him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Her lips curved into a smile that was equal parts alluring and dangerous. "You hesitate, Malrith," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "This is not like you." "I do not hesitate," Malrith replied, his voice steady despite the unease roiling in his chest. "I merely question the necessity of such drastic action." Celerith rose from her seat with the grace of a serpent uncoiling. She glided toward him, her dark robes trailing behind her like shadows given form. "Lord Velkhar is a threat to us both," she said, her tone soothing yet commanding. "His influence on the council grows by the day, and he has begun to question your recent movements. If we do not act now, he will crush us." Malrith frowned, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. "And you're certain he poses such a threat?" Celerith placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch cold and firm. "You must trust me, Malrith. Velkhar's death will send a message to our enemies that we are not to be trifled with. It will cement your place in Karand Kar as a force to be reckoned with." Her words filled him with a renewed sense of purpose, but a small voice at the back of his mind, one that sounded disturbingly like Malrith, whispered a warning. He shoved it aside. Celerith had guided him this far, she wouldn't lead him astray now. "Very well," Malrith said, his voice resolute. "Velkhar will fall." Celerith's smile widened, and for a fleeting moment, Malrith thought he saw something predatory in her eyes. "Good," she said, stepping back. "You will strike tonight. Make it clean, and ensure there are no witnesses. When it is done, return to me." The night was cold and silent as Malrith crept through the twisting corridors of Lord Velkhar's estate. His black cloak billowed behind him, blending seamlessly with the shadows. He had planned every step of the infiltration meticulously, bypassing guards and wards with the precision of a spider weaving its web. When he reached Velkhar's private chambers, he paused, his breath steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. He pushed the door open slowly, his dagger gleaming faintly in the moonlight that streamed through the tall, narrow windows. Velkhar lay on his bed, his chest rising and falling with the deep, even breaths of sleep. Malrith approached, his steps silent, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "This is for the future of Karand Kar," Malrith whispered, raising the dagger. The blade descended, striking true. Velkhar's eyes snapped open in shock, his mouth opening to scream, but Malrith's hand clamped over his lips. Within moments, the noble struggle ceased, his lifeblood pooling beneath him. Malrith stepped back, his breathing heavy. It was done. Velkhar was dead, and with his death, a path to power had been cleared. As Malrith made his way back to Celerith's tower, a strange unease settled over him. The assassination had gone too smoothly. Velkhar's defenses had been minimal, his guards strangely inattentive. It felt staged. When he entered Celerith's chamber, she was waiting for him, her expression unreadable. "It is done," Malrith said, his voice steady despite the lingering unease. Celerith's lips curved into a smile, but it was cold, lacking the warmth she had shown before. "Well done, Malrith. You have proven yourself capable." "Velkhar's defenses were lighter than I anticipated," Malrith said, narrowing his eyes, almost as if he were expecting me. Celerith tilted her head, her crimson eyes gleaming with amusement. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying," Malrith said slowly, that this was more than a mere assassination. Velkhar was no threat to us, was he? Solaris's smile widened, and she stepped closer, her voice low and mocking. Velkhar was my rival, Malrith. His death strengthens my position on the council, and in doing so, it strengthens us. Malrith's hands clenched into fists. You used me. I guided you, Solaris corrected, her tone sharp. You are a spider, Malrith, and spiders must weave their webs carefully. Velkhar's death was necessary, not just for me, but for you. His absence leaves a void, one that you can fill if you play your cards right. Malrith glared at her, his mind racing. He had been a pawn in her game, a tool to further her ambitions. But even as anger surged within him, so did a grudging respect. Solaris was as cunning as she was dangerous, and if he turned against her now, he would be crushed. You could have told me, Malrith said finally, his voice low. You could have trusted me. Solaris chuckled softly. Trust is a rare commodity in Karankar, my dear Malrith, but you have earned a place by my side, and that is worth far more. That night, as Malrith sat alone in his study, he replayed the events of the evening in his mind. He felt the sting of betrayal, but also the thrill of possibility. Velkhar's death had changed the balance of power in Karankar, and with Solaris at his side, he could still rise above his enemies. But a new thought gnawed at him, one that refused to be silenced. How long before I too become expendable? In the shadows, Velrith appeared, his expression grim. So, he said, leaning against the doorway, how does it feel to be played? Malrith didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the hearth. He knew Velrith was right, but admitting it was a weakness he could ill afford. The spider weaves again, Malrith muttered, more to himself than to Velrith. And next time, it will be my web. Velrith sighed, shaking his head. If you say so, my lord. But remember, the more you weave, the harder it is to escape your own web. Malrith said nothing, his mind already racing with plans. Solaris had used him, but she had also taught him a valuable lesson. Trust was a lie, and power was the only truth. And the spider would never stop spinning. Chapter 17. A botched assassination. The chill of the Naggaroth night bit deep as Malrith crouched atop the jagged parapet of House Sellerith's towering estate. The wind howled around him, carrying the faint scent of blood and incense from the city below. His breath hung in the air as he tightened his grip on the dagger at his side. This was not just another move in the game of power, it was a statement. Tonight he would eliminate one of Karankar's most influential figures, securing his place among the elite. Or so he told himself. This is madness, Velrith hissed from the shadows beside him, his voice low but urgent. His dark eyes scanned the courtyard below, where Sellerith's guards patrolled with the precise discipline of seasoned killers. Sellerith is too well protected. Even if you succeed, you won't make it out alive. Success is the only option, Malrith replied, his voice cold and resolute. Her death will destabilize the council and send a message to my enemies. Velrith sighed, shaking his head. You're playing right into their hands. If Sellerith dies, the council will come for you. And if you fail. I won't fail, Malrith snapped, cutting him off. Stay here and watch. When it's done, we'll retreat to the estate and prepare for the fallout. Velrith said nothing, though the doubt in his expression was clear. Malrith moved like a shadow, descending into the courtyard with practiced precision. The guards were predictable, their movements patterned and easily avoided. He slipped past them, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and anticipation. Reaching the inner sanctum of Sellerith's estate, he found her chambers unguarded, the heavy doors slightly ajar. Suspicion tugged at the edges of his mind, but he shoved it aside. This is the moment. He pushed the door open, dagger in hand, and stepped inside. Sellerith was waiting for him. She sat in a high-backed chair, her slender fingers draped over the arms, her sharp features illuminated by the faint glow of magical wards inscribed on the walls. Her lips curled into a smile that was both mocking and triumphant. Lord Duskblade, she said, her voice dripping with venom. How kind of you to visit. Malrith froze, his eyes darting to the corners of the room where shadows shifted unnaturally. Figures emerged from the darkness, Sabotage's personal guard, their blades drawn and their expressions cold. "You've been busy," Sabotage continued, rising from her chair with the grace of a serpent. "Plotting, scheming, spinning your little webs. Did you truly think I wouldn't notice?" Malrith's mind raced. He tightened his grip on the dagger, his gaze flicking between Sabotage and her guards. "This doesn't end here," he growled. Sabotage laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Oh, but it does. You've overstepped, Malrith. The council has already been informed of your treachery. By morning, your name will be a curse whispered in every corner of Kar. The guards lunged, their blades flashing in the dim light. Malrith fought with the ferocity of a cornered beast, his dagger finding flesh but doing little to turn the tide. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and entirely out of his depth. Just as a blade came dangerously close to his throat, a flash of steel cut through the air, and the guard fell, clutching his neck. Malrith stepped into the fray, his twin blades moving with lethal precision. "Didn't I tell you this was a terrible idea?" Malrith said, his tone almost conversational as he dispatched another guard. "Less talking, more killing," Malrith snarled, ducking beneath a swing. Together, they fought their way through the guards, the clash of steel and the cries of the dying echoing through the chamber. When they finally reached the courtyard, reinforcements were already pouring in, their torches casting an ominous glow on the frost-covered stones. "This way," Malrith barked, grabbing Malrith's arm and pulling him toward a hidden passage. They fled into the night, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as they wove through the labyrinthine streets of Kar. When they finally reached the safety of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Malrith collapsed against a wall, his chest heaving with exertion. Malrith paced nearby, wiping blood from his blades with a rag. "That," Malrith said, his voice tight with anger, "was a disaster." Malrith glared at him, his pride still raw. "You saved me." "Why?" "Because watching you get yourself killed isn't worth the trouble it would bring," Malrith replied. "Besides, I've grown accustomed to your madness. Keeps things interesting." Malrith smirked despite himself, but the weight of his failure quickly returned. He had been outplayed, and now the council would hunt him like a rabid beast. "What now?" Malrith asked, his tone softer. Malrith straightened, his dark eyes alight with a mixture of fury and determination. "We regroup. We rebuild. They think they've beaten me, but they haven't seen the last of Malrith Duskblade." Malrith sighed, shaking his head. "If you say so, my lord. Just try not to get us both killed next time." As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Malrith stared out at the shadowed city, his mind already racing with plans for revenge. The spider was wounded, but not yet broken, and when the time came, he would strike again. Chapter 18. Exile in the Shadows. The frozen wastes of Naggaroth stretched endlessly before Malrith, an unforgiving expanse of frost and shadow. The biting wind howled like a lament, cutting through his cloak and clawing at his face. He and Malrith trudged through the icy wilderness, their destination a forgotten outpost nestled at the edge of Kar's influence. The outpost, once a staging ground for raiding parties, was little more than a crumbling fortress now. Its jagged walls of black stone were coated in frost, its towers leaning like tired sentinels. Yet to Malrith, it was not a ruin. It was a sanctuary, a place to regroup, to plan, to rebuild. The mighty Malrith Duskblade, Malrith muttered as they approached the gates, his breath visible in the frigid air, reduced to squatting in a ruin at the edge of the world, truly inspiring. Malrith shot him a glare, though the sting of the words was undeniable. "This is temporary," he said, his voice firm despite his fatigue. "A setback, nothing more. You'll see, Malrith. From this place we will weave a new web, one stronger than anything Kar has ever seen." Malrith sighed but said nothing, following Malrith into the outpost's shadowed interior. The interior of the outpost was as bleak as its exterior. The main hall was dark and cold, its walls lined with tattered banners from forgotten campaigns. The few remaining structures were in varying states of disrepair, their purpose long since abandoned. Malrith surveyed the space, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. To most, this place would be a symbol of defeat. To him, it was an opportunity. "This will do," he said finally, his voice echoing through the hall. Malrith raised an eyebrow. "Do for what?" "Freezing to death. Because we're well on our way." "For rebuilding," Malrith replied, his tone tinged with irritation. "This place is defensible, isolated, the perfect foundation for our plans." Malrith leaned against a crumbling pillar, his arms crossed. "And what exactly are these plans? Because forgive me, my lord, but so far your schemes haven't exactly gone according to, well, any plan." Malrith ignored the barb, his mind already racing with possibilities. "The council thinks me defeated, cast out like a broken blade. Let them think that. It will lull them into complacency, make them vulnerable." "And while they're lulled," Malrith said, his tone dry, "we freeze to death in this charming little ruin. Truly a flawless strategy." Malrith turned to face him, his dark eyes blazing with determination. "You doubt me, Malrith. You always doubt me. But tell me this, if you're so certain I'm doomed to fail, why are you still here?" Malrith hesitated, his usual smirk absent. "Because I want to see how it ends," he said finally. "And because for all your faults, you're still the most interesting fool I've ever followed." Malrith allowed himself a small smile, though his resolve remained unshaken. "Then prepare yourself, Malrith. The spider is not finished yet." In the days that followed, Malrith threw himself into his work. He scavenged what supplies remained in the outpost, repaired the most vital structures, and began drafting new plans. His maps were spread across a makeshift table marked with intricate patterns of lines and symbols. Each mark represented a piece of the puzzle, a potential ally, a rival's weakness, a path to power. Malrith watched from the shadows, his expression a mixture of amusement and concern. "You're not rebuilding an empire," he said one night as Malrith pored over his notes. "You're building a house of cards. One wrong move, and it all collapses." "Then I won't make a wrong move," Malrith replied without looking up. "You've said that before," Malrith pointed out. "And I will say it again," Malrith said sharply. He stood, his cloak swirling around him like a shroud. "Failure is not the end, Malrith. It is merely a lesson, and I have learned much." Malrith chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Whatever you say, my lord. Just don't expect me to catch you when the house comes down." Malrith said nothing, returning his focus to the maps. His mind was a storm of ambition and anger, each thought sharpening his resolve. The council Solaris, Kalar, they had all underestimated him, but he would show them. He traced a line on the map with his finger, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The web spins again," he whispered to himself, "and this time it will not break." The outpost grew colder as the days stretched into weeks, but Malrith's fire burned brighter than ever. Each failure had only strengthened his resolve, each setback a stepping stone toward his ultimate goal. Malrith, despite his doubts, remained by his side, his loyalty as grim and unyielding as the Naggaroth winter. Together, they began laying the groundwork for a new plan, a plan that would either restore Malrith to power or consume them both. For Malrith, the choice was clear. The spider would rise again, or he would fall with the web he had woven. There was no middle ground. Chapter 19. A Desperate Gambit. The map was old, its parchment yellowed and brittle, its ink faded to faint lines and cryptic symbols. Malrith traced one of the markings with his gloved finger, his dark eyes alight with fervor. The map promised much, a forgotten ruin deep in the icy wastes of Naggaroth, said to house an artifact of immense power. "This," Malrith said, his voice filled with conviction, "is the key to our resurgence." Malrith, standing across the table, leaned closer to study the map. He raised an eyebrow, his skepticism plain. A ruin in the middle of nowhere, conveniently untouched for who knows how long, and conveniently tied to a promise of untold power. Doesn't that strike you as suspicious? "Everything in Naggaroth is suspicious," Malrith replied, brushing off the concern. "This ruin predates even the founding of Kar. It was a temple, a place of power, built by those who understood the secrets of sorcery better than any of us today. If even half of what is written about it is true, the artifact inside could turn the tide in our favor." Malrith crossed his arms, his expression dubious. And the other half? The part that isn't true? Malrith's lips curled into a thin smile. Then it's a ruin and nothing more. But I'm willing to take the risk. We can't stay here, Malrith. Our resources are dwindling, and our enemies grow stronger by the day. This artifact, if it exists, could restore our fortunes and more. Malrith sighed, shaking his head. You really think some dusty trinket will solve all your problems? I don't think, Malrith said sharply. I know. The trek to the ruin was grueling. The icy winds of Naggaroth howled through the barren wasteland, battering Malrith and Malrith as they trudged through knee-deep snow. The skeletal remains of long-dead trees dotted the landscape, their twisted forms casting eerie shadows under Morsleep's pale glow. Malrith grumbled as they climbed yet another ridge, his breath visible in the frigid air. You'd think with all your schemes you could have planned for a warmer destination. Fortune favors the bold, Malrith replied, his tone clipped. He refused to let the cold dampen his resolve. At last they crested the ridge and saw it, the ruin. It jutted from the frozen ground like a jagged wound, its black stone walls covered in frost. Strange runes glowed faintly along the archways, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. Malrith whistled softly. Well, that's ominous. Malrith ignored him, his eyes fixed on the structure. This is it, he said, his voice filled with awe. The Temple of Karatas, the place of power I've been seeking. The air inside the ruin was heavy, thick with an unnatural energy that prickled at their skin. The walls were lined with carvings depicting twisted forms, half-elven figures with elongated limbs and faces locked in expressions of torment and ecstasy. Malrith ran a hand along one of the carvings, his expression dark. Whoever built this place wasn't exactly hosting banquets. It was a temple, Malrith said, his voice reverent. A place where power was worshipped, where the strong took what they desired, and the weak were consumed. Charming, Malrith muttered, drawing his blade as they moved deeper into the ruin. The corridors twisted and turned, leading them ever downward. The faint glow of the runes grew brighter as they descended, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Finally, they emerged into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. At the center of the room stood an altar, and upon it rested the artifact. The artifact was a dark orb, its surface swirling with what seemed like liquid shadow. The air around it buzzed with raw energy, and Malrith felt a shiver run down his spine. This is it, he whispered, stepping toward the altar. This is what we came for. Malrith grabbed his arm, stopping him. Wait, you don't know what that thing is, or what it will do. I know enough, Malrith said, pulling free. He approached the altar, his heart pounding. As Malrith reached for the orb, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, coalescing into shapes that whispered in an ancient, guttural tongue. The air grew colder, the buzzing energy more intense. Malrith said sharply, his hand tightening on his blade. This doesn't feel right. It's power, Malrith said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. True power. He grasped the orb, and the moment his fingers touched its surface, a surge of energy shot through him. His vision blurred, and his mind was flooded with images, scenes of death, conquest, and betrayal, all swirling together in a chaotic storm. He staggered back, clutching the orb to his chest. It's incredible, he gasped. Malrith stepped forward, his expression tense. What did you see? Everything, Malrith said, his voice trembling with awe. Victory, domination. The council brought to its knees. This is what we've been waiting for, Malrith. This is our salvation. As they made their way out of the ruin, the orb clutched tightly in Malrith's hands. Malrith couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The shadows seemed to follow them, whispering in a language he didn't understand. You sure this is worth it? Malrith asked as they emerged into the icy night. Malrith turned to him, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. Worth it? This is everything, Malrith. With this, we will reclaim our place in Karankar. No one will mock us again. No one will stand in our way. Malrith frowned but said nothing. He had seen Malrith's schemes fail before, but this time felt different. The power of the orb was undeniable, but so was the sense of unease it brought. As they trudged back toward their outpost, Malrith's mind raced with plans. The spider was spinning a new web, one more intricate and powerful than ever before. And this time he would not fail. Chapter 20. The Price of Power. The orb sat at the center of the ruined hall, its dark surface swirling with liquid shadows that seemed alive. The once dilapidated outpost now felt suffused with an unnatural energy, the air thick with the weight of something ancient and malevolent. Malrith stood before the artifact, his back to Valrith, his hands trembling as he stared into its depths. "It's speaking to me," Malrith said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel its power coursing through me." Valrith watched from the edge of the room, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "It's not power, Malrith. It's poison. You've been different ever since you brought that thing back." Malrith turned, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that sent a chill down Valrith's spine. "Different. I am awakening, Valrith. This artifact, it's more than I imagined. It holds the secrets of the ancients, their strength, their knowledge. With this I can crush the council, destroy Kilar, and rise above them all. Or it will destroy you first," Valrith said sharply. He stepped forward, his voice tinged with frustration. "Look at yourself, Malrith. You haven't slept in days. You barely eat. And you're speaking to a damned relic like it's a trusted advisor. This isn't power, it's madness." Malrith's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't understand. You've never understood. This is destiny, Valrith. Mine. I was meant to find this artifact, to wield it, to reshape Karen Carr in my image." Valrith shook his head, his expression hardening. "Destiny. That thing isn't leading you to greatness. It's feeding on you. I can see it. The longer you hold on to it, the more it twists you. If you can't let it go, I'll destroy it myself." The moment the words left Valrith's mouth, Malrith's expression shifted, his face contorting with fury. "You dare?" he hissed, stepping between Valrith and the orb. "You think you can take this from me?" "I'm trying to save you," Valrith said, his voice calm but firm. "This artifact, it's cursed, Malrith. You've seen the stories carved into that ruin. It consumed the ones who built it, and now it's doing the same to you." "You don't know what you're talking about," Malrith spat. "This power is mine by right. I've sacrificed everything for this moment, and you," he pointed a trembling finger at Valrith, "you will not take it from me." Valrith drew his blade, the steel glinting in the dim light. "I won't let you throw your life away for this madness." For a moment the room was silent, the tension between them crackling like a storm about to break. Then, with a snarl, Malrith drew his own blade, the motion swift and fluid. "You've betrayed me, Valrith," Malrith said, his voice trembling with rage. "Just like the others. I trusted you." "And I stayed, despite everything," Valrith replied. "But this is too far." The clash of steel rang out as their blades met, the force of the impact reverberating through the chamber. Valrith was the more skilled fighter, his movements precise and calculated, but Malrith fought with a ferocity born of desperation. His strikes were wild, fueled by his obsession with the artifact. "You can't see it, can you?" Valrith said as he parried another blow. "This thing has already taken you. It's not guiding you, it's using you." "Lies," Malrith roared, pressing the attack. "It has shown me what I can become. It has given me purpose." Valrith sidestepped, narrowly avoiding a downward slash. "At what cost, Malrith? Look at yourself." For a moment, the words seemed to register. Malrith hesitated, his blade lowering slightly. His eyes darted to the orb, then back to Valrith, as if caught between two worlds. Then, the shadows around the orb pulsed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Malrith's expression hardened, his resolve returning with a terrifying intensity. "I don't need saving," he said coldly. "I need power." With a roar, he lunged at Valrith, their blades locking in a final, desperate clash. Valrith twisted his sword, forcing Malrith to stumble back. But instead of pressing the attack, Valrith stepped away, lowering his weapon. I can't do this, Naggaroth said, his voice heavy with resignation. If you want to destroy yourself, fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. Malrith stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his blade still clenched tightly in his hand. The whispers from the orb had quieted, but their presence lingered, a sinister undercurrent that filled the chamber. You'll see, Malrith said, his voice barely above a whisper. When I return to Karin Kar with this power, they'll all see. The council, Kellar, even you, Valrith. Valrith sheathed his blade, his expression grim. I hope you're right, Malrith, for your sake. As he turned and walked away, the shadows seemed to close in around Malrith, their cold tendrils wrapping tighter with each passing moment. He placed a hand on the orb, its surface pulsing beneath his touch, and felt its power coursing through him once more. This is only the beginning, Malrith murmured, a faint smile curling his lips. The spider's web grows stronger with every thread. But in the depths of his mind, a part of him, small and fragile, wondered if Valrith was right, if the price of power was more than he could bear. The orb whispered in response, drowning out the doubt. Chapter 21. Silaris returns. The room grew colder as the shadows shifted unnaturally, coiling and twisting as if alive. Malrith stood over the artifact, his hand resting lightly on its dark surface, feeling its pulse of raw, intoxicating power. The whispers that had become his constant companions faded into silence as a familiar voice cut through the gloom. Malrith Duskblade, Silaris Nightthorn's voice rang out, smooth and sharp as a blade. Malrith turned sharply, his dark eyes narrowing. She stood at the entrance to the chamber, her presence commanding, her crimson eyes glinting with amusement. Clad in flowing robes that shimmered like liquid shadow, she exuded an air of power that both awed and unnerved him. Silaris, Malrith said, his voice edged with both suspicion and awe. I did not summon you. She smiled, stepping closer, her movements as fluid as a serpent's. And yet, here I am. I've heard whispers of your recent acquisition, the ancient artifact of Karatas, no less. Impressive. Very impressive. Malrith straightened, his hand tightening on the orb. It is more than impressive. It is power itself, and it is mine. Silaris raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. Yours, of course. I would expect nothing less from you, Malrith. You've always had a knack for seizing opportunity. That is why I've come, to offer you another. Malrith's eyes narrowed, his grip on the orb unyielding. Opportunity. What could you possibly offer that I do not already have? Silaris stopped a few paces away, her gaze flicking to the orb before meeting his. You have power, yes, but power without purpose is like a blade without a wielder. The artifact is a weapon, Malrith, but it requires direction. And she placed a hand on her chest, her voice softening, am offering you the chance to wield it as part of something greater. Greater, Malrith repeated, suspicion lacing his tone. Silaris began to circle him, her robes trailing like smoke. Karin Kar is stagnant, its council bloated with arrogance and weakness. A new order must rise from the ashes, one forged in strength and guided by vision. Together we can create that order, Malrith. You, with your cunning and determination, and me, with my expertise. Malrith felt a thrill of both exhilaration and unease at her words. You think I will simply hand this artifact over to you? I am no one's pawn, Silaris. Silaris stopped behind him, her voice low and almost tender. A pawn? No, Malrith. A partner. This artifact is dangerous, its power untempered, its whispers insidious. But with my guidance you can master it. Together we can reshape Naggaroth to suit our will. He hesitated, her words stirring a mix of ambition and doubt within him. He wanted to believe her, to see her as an ally rather than a rival. But he had seen the game she played before, and he was not so easily deceived. What do you truly want, Silaris? Malrith asked, his voice hard. She stepped into his line of sight, her crimson eyes gleaming. What I want, Malrith, is to see you rise, to see your name whispered in fear and reverence across Naggaroth. But to do that, you must let go of this paranoia, this need to clutch at power like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. Trust me, and I will help you wield the artifact's full potential." The orb pulsed beneath Malrith's hand, its whispers returning, though quieter now, as if waiting for his decision. He felt the weight of Solaris's gaze, her presence both a challenge and an invitation. "And what is your role in this new order?" Malrith asked, his tone guarded. Solaris smiled, her expression inscrutable. "I will be your guide, your equal. Together we will dismantle the old ways and build something stronger. But the artifact must be tempered. It must be wielded with care. If you hold on to it alone, it will consume you." Valrith's voice echoed in Malrith's mind. "It's not guiding you, it's using you." Malrith's jaw tightened, his thoughts a storm of conflicting desires. He could feel the power of the artifact, its seductive pull, its promise of dominance. But Solaris's words rang true. He could not wield it alone, not fully. Finally, he stepped back from the orb, his expression unreadable. "And if I agree?" Solaris's smile widened. "Then we begin a new chapter, one where your name will eclipse even that of Kalar, of the Council, of all who dared mock you. But you must choose, Malrith. Do you cling to solitary ambition, or do you embrace destiny with me by your side?" Malrith reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered over the orb. He looked at Solaris, her gaze steady, unwavering. In her eyes, he saw both a promise and a warning. "I will join you," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "But do not mistake this for submission, Solaris. I will not be a pawn in your schemes." Her laughter was soft, almost musical. "Of course not, Malrith. You are no pawn, you are a king in the making, and together we will claim the throne." As she stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on his arm, Malrith felt a surge of exhilaration. The spider's web was growing, and for the first time he believed it could truly ensnare all who had wronged him. But deep in the recesses of his mind, a whisper lingered, a warning, a doubt. Whether it came from the orb or from his own buried instincts, he could not tell. The price of power was rising, and Malrith could only hope he was willing to pay it. Chapter 22. Valrith's Defiance. The artifact sat on its pedestal, its swirling shadows casting an eerie glow over the crumbling hall. Its presence had grown heavier, as though the very air around it pulsed with dark intent. Malrith stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the orb. Whispers of power and promise filled his mind, drowning out the sounds of the desolate outpost. Behind him, Valrith entered the chamber silently. His movements were purposeful, his expression grim. He carried no torch. Only the dim light of the artifact illuminated his path. The shadows made his sharp features even starker, his scarred face a mask of resolve. "Malrith," Valrith said, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. Malrith didn't turn, his eyes still locked on the orb. "Valrith, I wondered when you'd finally come." Valrith stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "You know why I'm here." A faint smile curved Malrith's lips. "I do. You've always been predictable. Loyal, yes, but painfully predictable." Valrith's grip on his sword tightened. "This has gone too far, Malrith. That artifact, it's not just corrupting you. It's destroying you. I've stood by your side through every mad scheme, every reckless gamble, but this will kill you, and I won't stand here and watch it happen." Malrith finally turned, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that sent a chill through Valrith. "Kill me. No, Valrith. It is transforming me. This artifact is not a curse, it's a gift. It has shown me what I can become, what we can achieve. You're too blind to see it." Valrith took a step forward, his voice rising. "What I see is a man so consumed by ambition that he's forgotten who he is. You're not the spider anymore, Malrith. You're a puppet, dancing to the tune of a relic that will devour you the moment it's done with you." Malrith's smile faded, replaced by cold anger. "You betray me, then? After everything we've been through?" "This isn't betrayal," Valrith said, drawing his blade. "It's mercy. I'm taking the artifact, Malrith, and if I have to fight you to do it, so be it." The tension in the chamber snapped like a bowstring as Malrith drew his own blade. its edge gleaming with a faint, otherworldly light. "You're a fool, Malrith. This power was never meant for you." "And it wasn't meant for you to wield alone," Malrith shot back, lunging forward. Their blades clashed, the sound echoing through the hall like thunder. Malrith's strikes were precise and measured, honed by years of battle. Malrith's movements, however, were wild and unpredictable, his blade fueled by desperation and the artifact's insidious whispers. "You think you're saving me?" Malrith snarled, parrying a thrust. "You're condemning me, condemning us to mediocrity." Malrith dodged a sweeping strike, his eyes filled with equal parts fury and sorrow. "Better mediocrity than madness, Malrith. This isn't who you are." Their blades locked, sparks flying as they pressed against each other. For a moment, they were face to face, their breaths ragged, their gazes locked. "Who I am," Malrith said through gritted teeth, "is who I was always meant to be. You don't understand, Malrith. You never have." "I understand more than you think," Malrith replied, shoving Malrith back. "I've followed you because I believed in you. But this isn't belief, it's delusion." As they fought, the shadows around the artifact began to writhe, their movements unnatural and unsettling. The orb pulsed with dark energy, feeding on the conflict, its whispers growing louder. Malrith's strikes grew more erratic, his movements less controlled. Malrith noticed the change, his expression darkening. "It's consuming you, Malrith. Can't you feel it?" "I feel nothing but power," Malrith roared, his blade slicing through the air. Malrith sidestepped the attack, his voice filled with anger and desperation. "You're wrong. Look at yourself, you're not even fighting me anymore. You're fighting for it." Malrith hesitated for a fraction of a second, the words cutting through his rage like a dagger. That moment of hesitation was all Malrith needed. He disarmed Malrith with a swift strike, sending his blade clattering to the ground. But as Malrith turned toward the artifact, Malrith lunged, tackling him to the ground. The two grappled, their struggle fierce and unrelenting. Neither could bring themselves to deliver the killing blow, their shared history staying their hands even as their conflict raged. At last they broke apart, both gasping for breath. Malrith crawled to the orb, his hand resting on its surface, as he glared at Malrith. "Leave," Malrith said, his voice low and venomous. "If you can't see the path forward, then walk away. But do not stand in my way again." Malrith rose slowly, his blade still in hand. For a long moment he stared at Malrith, his expression filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. "You're lost, Malrith," he said finally, his voice heavy. "And I can't follow you anymore." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the chamber. Malrith watched him go, his hand tightening on the orb as its whispers filled his mind once more. "You will see," Malrith murmured to himself. "They will all see. The spider's web is not undone. It is stronger than ever." But as he sat alone in the chamber, the artifact's dark energy wrapping around him like a shroud, even Malrith could not deny the weight of what he had lost. Chapter 23. The web collapses. The shadows in the ruined hall seemed thicker than usual, their oppressive weight pressing down on Malrith as he paced. The artifact rested on its pedestal, its swirling darkness casting an unnatural glow across the room. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, filling his thoughts with visions of triumph and revenge. But tonight, something felt wrong. Celeresse had summoned him to a meeting, a final step in their supposed partnership. She had spoken of plans to confront the council, to rise above their petty squabbles, and take control of Karon Kar together. Yet the details had been vague, her tone almost too sweet. "She's plotting something," Malrith murmured to himself, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "But she underestimates me. The spider sees all." He turned sharply as the doors to the hall creaked open. For a brief moment, hope flared in his chest. Perhaps Celeresse had come to deliver her part of the bargain. But when the figures entered, clad in dark armor and moving with the precision of assassins, his hope turned to dread. Malrith drew his blade as the first agent lunged at him, their strike swift and silent. He parried the blow, the clash of steel echoing through the hall. "Silurus sends her regards," one of the assassins hissed, their voice muffled by their helm. "So, the snake reveals her fangs," Malrith growled, driving the attacker back with a flurry of strikes. The agents moved as one, their attacks coordinated and relentless. Malrith fought with the desperation of a cornered beast, his blade flashing in the dim light. But for every strike he landed, another assassin closed in, their numbers overwhelming. He stumbled back, blood dripping from a shallow wound on his arm. The whispers of the artifact grew louder, urging him to grasp its power, to use it to destroy his enemies. But before he could reach for it, a blade found its mark, slashing across his side and sending him to his knees. Malrith gasped, clutching his wound as the assassins closed in. Their leader stepped forward, their blade poised for the killing blow. "For all your scheming," the leader said, their tone mocking, "you were always just a pawn in her game." As the blade descended, Malrith braced himself for the end, but the killing blow never came. A sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by a flash of steel. One of the assassins crumpled to the ground, a dagger lodged in their throat. Malrith emerged from the shadows, his twin blades already drawn. His expression was grim, his movements swift and deadly as he engaged the assassins. "You just can't stop getting yourself killed, can you?" Malrith muttered, cutting down another attacker. Malrith staggered to his feet, his grip on his sword weak but determined. Together, they fought off the remaining assassins, their bond as warriors outweighing the fractures in their relationship, if only for a moment. When the last assassin fell, the hall was silent once more, save for the sound of their labored breathing. Malrith turned to Malrith, his face etched with anger and disbelief. "Silurus betrayed you. How did you not see this coming?" Malrith leaned heavily on his blade, his voice low and filled with bitterness. "I thought I could outmaneuver her. I thought she believed in me." Malrith laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Believed in you, Malrith, she used you, just like I told you she would. You're so blinded by your delusions that you can't see what's right in front of you." Malrith's gaze snapped to Malrith, his eyes blazing with fury. "And yet you're still here. You could have left me to die, but you didn't. Why?" Malrith sheathed his blades, his expression hard. "Maybe I should have. But for some reason I keep hoping you'll wake up and see the truth, that this path you're on is going to destroy you, and everyone around you." Malrith took a shaky step forward, his voice trembling with rage and desperation. "I don't need your pity, Malrith. I don't need anyone. I will rebuild stronger than before. And when I do, Silurus will pay for this." Malrith shook his head, his voice filled with quiet anger. "You're hopeless, Malrith. I saved you tonight, but don't think for a second that I'll do it again." He turned and walked away, leaving Malrith alone with the artifact and the crushing weight of his failure. Malrith sank to his knees before the artifact, his blood staining the floor beneath him. The whispers returned, soothing and seductive, promising revenge, power, and redemption. "You were right," Malrith murmured, his voice barely audible. "I trusted her. I let her in, and she betrayed me." The shadows around the artifact seemed to writhe in response, their movements almost comforting. "But she will pay," Malrith said, his voice growing stronger. "They will all pay." He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the orb's swirling surface. The dark energy coursed through him, numbing his pain and sharpening his resolve. As the whispers filled his mind, Malrith vowed that this would not be the end. The spider's web had collapsed, but he would weave another, stronger, darker, and deadlier than before, even if it meant losing the last thread of his humanity. Chapter 24. The Death of Malrith Duskblade. The frost-covered plains of Naggaroth stretched endlessly before Malrith as he stood atop a jagged hill, his battered armor glinting faintly under the pale light of Morsleep. Behind him, the ruins of his plans lay scattered like ashes, each failure a wound deeper than steel could carve. The whispers of the artifact had grown quieter, but they still lingered, their seductive pull now a cruel mockery of his broken ambition. Below, the dark spires of Solaris Nightthorn's stronghold rose like a monument to her treachery. Its jagged walls bristled with defenses, its towers pulsing with the faint glow of wards. Her forces swarmed within, arrogant and complacent, believing themselves invincible. "They will pay," Malrith murmured, his voice hoarse but resolute. His hand rested on the hilt of his blade, his fingers trembling with a mixture of fury and desperation. "For every betrayal, for every insult, they will all pay." Behind him, Malrith approached, his expression grim. "You're really going through with this, aren't you?" Malrith turned, his dark eyes blazing with a manic light. "I have nothing left to lose, Malrith. Nothing but my vengeance. And that is worth everything." Malrith sighed, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "This is suicide, Malrith. You know that, don't you?" Malrith's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "Perhaps. But if I die, I'll take her down with me. The spider's web will claim one final victim." The gates of Solaris's stronghold erupted in flames as Malrith and Malrith launched their attack. The mercenaries and loyalists Malrith had managed to rally were few in number, their equipment mismatched and their morale shaky. Yet they fought with the desperation of the damned, cutting down Solaris's guards as they stormed the outer walls. Malrith led the charge, his blade flashing in the dim light, as he struck down anyone who dared stand in his path. His movements were erratic, fueled by a mix of fury and the lingering energy of the artifact. He was a storm given form, each strike a declaration of his defiance. Malrith fought at his side, his strikes calculated and precise. Yet even as he dispatched their enemies, his gaze kept drifting to Malrith, his expression heavy with unspoken grief. "You're going to get yourself killed," Malrith said between strikes. "That's the idea," Malrith snarled, driving his blade into the chest of a guard. "But not before I see her fall." They reached the heart of the stronghold, a grand chamber illuminated by flickering torches. Solaris awaited them, her crimson eyes gleaming with amusement. She stood at the center of the room, flanked by her elite guards, her robes flowing like shadows around her. "Malrith," she said, her voice smooth and mocking, "you've saved me the trouble of hunting you down. How thoughtful." Malrith stepped forward, his bloodied blade pointing at her. "Your lies end here, Solaris. Your schemes, your betrayal, all of it ends tonight." Solaris laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "You truly believe you can defeat me? Look around you, Malrith. You've brought nothing but scraps to a war you've already lost." "Perhaps," Malrith said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, "but even scraps can tear the flesh from the bone." With a roar, he charged, his blade arsing toward her. Her guards moved to intercept, but Malrith was there, cutting them down with ruthless efficiency. The chamber erupted into chaos, steel clashing and blood spilling as the battle raged. Malrith fought with the desperation of a man who knew he was doomed. His strikes were wild, his movements reckless, but his sheer ferocity drove Solaris back. For a brief moment, he believed he could win. Then the artifact's whispers returned, louder than ever. They urged him forward, promising victory, glory, and revenge. He pressed on, his blade slicing through Solaris's wards, but with each step, the artifact's power drained more of his strength. Solaris struck back, her magic lashing out like a serpent. Malrith dodged and countered, his blade finding its mark and cutting through her defenses. Blood stained her robes, and for the first time, her confident smile faltered. But as Malrith raised his blade for the killing blow, the artifact's whispers reached a crescendo. His vision blurred, his limbs trembling as the dark energy consumed him. Solaris seized the opportunity, her blade finding his side and driving deep. Malrith staggered, his sword falling from his grasp. He dropped to his knees, his vision dimming as Solaris loomed over him, her expression triumphant. "You were always a fool, Malrith," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Before she could strike again, Malrith's blade pierced her back. Her eyes widened in shock as she crumpled to the ground, the life draining from her. Malrith knelt beside Malrith, his hands trembling as he tried to staunch the bleeding. "You idiot," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why did you have to push this far?" Malrith's lips curled into a faint smile, his breathing shallow. Because it was the only way. The web is broken, Malrith, but the spider still bites. Malrith said nothing, his jaw tightening as Malrith's eyes drifted closed. The chamber grew silent, the flickering torches casting long shadows over the bodies that littered the floor. When the dawn broke over the ruins of the stronghold, Solaris's forces lay in ruin, their power shattered. But Malrith Duskblade, the spider of Karankar, was no more. Malrith stood at the edge of the battlefield, his blade sheathed, his expression unreadable. For all his cynicism and doubt, he had stayed to the bitter end. And though Malrith's schemes had led them to this moment, his final act of defiance had left its mark. The web had collapsed, but its strands lingered, their echoes carried on the icy winds of Naggaroth. Chapter 25. Malrith's Legacy. The frigid wind of Naggaroth howled across the ruins of Solaris's stronghold, carrying with it the echoes of a battle long ended. Malrith stood atop the scorched parapets, his cloak billowing behind him as he stared out over the desolate landscape. The dawn was faint and cold, its light offering little warmth against the bitter frost. Below, the remnants of Solaris's forces lay scattered, broken by the final confrontation. The stronghold itself was silent, its dark towers standing like gravestones against the pale sky. And somewhere within the rubble, the lifeless body of Malrith Duskblade, the spider of Karankar, lay amid the ruins of his ambition. Malrith closed his eyes, his breath misting in the cold air. His body ached from the battle, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight in his chest, the bitter realization that he had followed Malrith to the very edge of madness, only to watch him fall. Malrith's voice echoed in Malrith's mind, the impassioned declarations of a man who had dreamed of power and greatness, but had been undone by his own delusions. "The spider's web will ensnare them all," Malrith had once said. Malrith had scoffed at the time, but a part of him had wanted to believe it. Malrith's ambition had been infectious, a spark of defiance against the cruelty and stagnation of Naggaroth. But ambition, Malrith realized now, was not enough. Malrith had been blinded by his dreams, unable to see the cracks in his web until it had collapsed around him. Malrith opened his eyes, his gaze falling on the horizon where the icy waste met the storm-laden sky. "You were a fool, Malrith," he murmured. "But you had fire, and for a time I thought that fire could burn brighter than the cold reality of this place." He looked down at the blade in his hand, the weapon that had saved him more times than he cared to count. The blood on its edge had long since frozen, a stark reminder of the price of loyalty. "But fire alone can't survive in Naggaroth," he said to himself. "It consumes everything, even the one who kindles it." Malrith descended from the parapets, his boots crunching over the frost-covered stone. The stronghold was quiet now, its halls abandoned save for the ghosts of the dead. He had no reason to linger. There was nothing left here but memories and ash. He made his way to the docks, where a single raiding ship awaited. Its dark hull was weathered but sturdy, its sails furled against the wind. It had been left behind in the chaos of the battle, a forgotten relic of Solaris's fleet. Malrith climbed aboard, his movements slow but deliberate. He stood at the helm, his hand resting on the wheel as he gazed out at the frozen sea. The waters were treacherous, filled with jagged ice and unseen dangers, but they offered something Naggaroth never could: freedom. He thought of Malrith one last time, the man who had dragged him into a web of ambition and madness, and who had ultimately paid the price for his hubris. "You wanted to change everything," Malrith said softly, the wind carrying his words away. "But you couldn't change yourself." As the ship drifted away from the dock, Malrith felt a strange sense of clarity. He had followed Malrith because he had believed, however briefly, that the spider's web could catch something greater than the fleeting scraps of power Naggaroth offered. But now he understood, ambition without wisdom was a trap, and Malrith had woven it for himself. Malrith tightened his grip on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "No more webs," he said, his voice steady. "No more delusions." The ship's sails caught the wind, and the vessel began to move, cutting through the icy waters. Malrith did not look back. Naggaroth, with its shadows and betrayals, its whispers of power and promises of ruin, was behind him now. For the first time in years, he felt free. And as the ship sailed into the unknown, Malrith vowed to forge his own path, one unbound by the schemes of others, and unshackled from the ghosts of his past. The spider was dead, but his legacy would not follow. Malrith would carry only one truth with him: survival was the only victory that mattered.